The wind comes low out of the north, and it carries that clean metallic bite that only shows up when the temperature drops so fast the world seems to tighten. Snow's already down, not the soft, pretty kind folks put on postcards. This is the hard, dry kind that squeaks under a boot and turns your breath into a white rag that flaps and vanishes. Somewhere out in the dark, a horse stamps. The sound is small, but out here, small sounds carry like confession. A lantern hangs in the Dunbar kitchen window, trimmed low, the flame shivering, the glass filmed with soot. The whole house smells of tallow and damp wool and coffee that's been boiled twice because there isn't enough to waste. 11 people inside if you count the 2 children and the old woman who can't get out of bed. 8 hands that can hold a rifle. 2 that have never fired one at a living thing. There are 2 crates of ammunition under the table, pine wood stained with oil, the brass cartridges cold as teeth. Somebody's counted them already. Somebody's done the arithmetic and didn't like the answer. The well out back is down to mud. You drop the bucket and it comes up slow, scraping stone, and what you pull up stinks faintly of iron and roots. They've been melting snow on the stove, feeding it in a pot, listening to it hiss and thinking how strange it is that you can be surrounded by white water and still be thirsty. There is a pot of beans going too, and a heel of bread wrapped in cloth, and the sound of the house settling, wood sighing under frost like an old man in his sleep. Outside, the riders are spaced in a crescent, just far enough apart that the darkness between them looks like another kind of man. 27 by the count of the boy who crawled to the attic and risked the window. 27 horses, their hides steaming, tack creaking, the leather stiff with cold. A few lanterns hooded and kept low, the light not for comfort, but for work. You can smell them if the wind shifts, sweat, tobacco, horse piss, that sharp gun oil smell. You can hear a cough and then the careful quiet after, like they all remembered at the same time what silence is worth. These men aren't ghosts and they aren't savages. They're neighbors. That's the part that doesn't fit the legend. Men with last names you've heard in church. Men who've borrowed fence pliers from you and returned them late. Men who've sat at your table and watched your wife pour coffee. There's one with a scar that came from a branding iron accident 10 years back. There's one whose brother broke his neck in a shoot on Dunbar property and got buried under a pine board with a cross that already leans. And at the center of it all, the paper. A deed. A sheaf of it, really. Thin pages with thick meanings. Ink signatures and stamps and numbers that pretend to be clean. Somewhere in this house is a document that says Dunbar owns what lies under the grass and what runs through it, owns the creek, owns the draw, owns the cottonwoods that drink first, owns a piece of earth measured in acres, the way a man measures a carcass in pounds. 22,000 acres, give or take, depending on which surveyor held the chain and which judge believed him. Land that, if you were to price it this winter, might bring $12 an acre on a desperate day, maybe 18 on a hopeful one. Land that is worth more than any of these men will ever see in cash, which is why they are here with rifles instead of receipts. A shot cracks from somewhere beyond the corral. Not aimed, not yet, just a statement. The sound goes out across the flats and comes back smaller, like the land itself is listening and deciding whether it cares. Inside, a woman flinches and then gets angry at herself for flinching. A man at the table touches his wedding ring like it can anchor him. The patriarch, Dunbar, sits with his back to the wall because he's got the cough again and he doesn't want anybody to see the tremor in his hands. His knuckles are split from chopping frozen wood. His eyes have that rim of red that comes from too many nights of too much thinking. They will tell you later that this began with a gun. They will tell you the Dunbar Ranch was besieged because of jealousy, because of lawlessness, because men back then were meaner and simpler. It makes a fine story. It puts the blame in the air, like weather. But the truth is colder, and it has names and balances. The truth is that the siege began years earlier, in a courthouse with coal heat and a clerk who liked his liquor, and in a bank office where the ink never froze. It began in drought charts and freight rates, in cattle prices by the hundredweight, in wages dropped from $18 a month to $14 when the grass failed, in water rights that were signed away with a shaky X because somebody couldn't read the words that were eating them alive. So what is this, really, this ring of men around a lit window on a frozen night? Is it the punishment for a dynasty that took too much and called it grit? Or is it simply the next turn of the American wheel, where land becomes money, money becomes law, and law becomes a gun when the paper stops working? Was the Dunbar Ranch built by vision and backbone, or by leverage and quiet violence, and an invisible army of hands whose names never made it into the family Bible? And when the world tightens, when the market slips, when the rain doesn't come, when a deed is just a rumor in the dark, who owns a place like this then? The man with the signature or the men with the hunger? All right, Russ Daniels here, just stepping out for a second. I've been digging through county records, old clips, and ranch country oral histories to build toward a steady cadence on this whole story, and I'm trying to make this full-time because I genuinely love this country and the people in it. So if you'll make a calm little pact with me and hit subscribe, it don't cost a thing. And I gotta ask, why are you watching right now anyway? Do you love ranches or something? They say it started with a handshake on a sunlit porch. A drifter with honest eyes and a strong back offered a stretch of prairie by a generous old-timer who'd seen enough blood and just wanted peace before God took him. It makes a clean story. It lets you believe empires grow the way gardens do, by sunlight and patience. But the truth is colder. The truth is paper. The truth is a stamp in a county courthouse and a clerk with cracked fingernails who knew exactly what a man would pay to be first in line when the land was being turned into property. It was 1883, late spring, when the Dunbar name first came down into that country like a nail driven into green wood. Not the Dunbar Ranch yet, not the grand word, just a man, Elias Dunbar, 27 years old by his own saying, older in the eyes, with a coat that smelled of smoke and horse, and a bedroll tied behind a saddle that had seen too many miles. He came up out of the south along the breaks of a river that ran shallow that year, a gray ribbon over stone. The locals called it the Red Willow, not because it was red, not truly, but because the willows along it turned the color of old wounds in October, and nobody out here forgot the look of a wound. He rode alone for most of it, alone in the way a man can be alone even when he's moving through a country full of other men doing the same math. Because that's what it was now, math. The old talk about open range and God's grass was already thinning. Rail lines were pushing west with schedules and tariffs. Surveyors were coming through with chains and compasses. slicing the horizon into rectangles like butchers with a carcass. The Homestead Act wasn't a story anymore. It was a machine. Put in your time, file your claim, prove it up, pay your fees, and if you were clever or lucky, you could turn a little square of dirt into a future. He carried $38. Not a legend, not a fortune. $38 in coin and a few bills, wrapped in oilcloth and tied under his shirt so close to his skin that the sweat from his body had already softened the edges. He had a rifle, an old Springfield that kicked like a mule, and he had a mule too, stubborn and narrow-hipped, hauling a small crate of tools, a post-hole auger, a hammer, a handsaw, a coil of rope, a tin coffee pot blackened on the bottom. What he didn't have was the thing people liked to pretend was enough back then: time. Out here, time wasn't romance. It was survival. You missed one planting. You missed one water season. You missed one filing deadline. The country didn't care what kind of man you were. The geography was unforgiving and exact. To the west, low ridges that looked gentle until you tried to cross them and found the shale underfoot sliding like loose teeth. To the east, miles of open plain, short grass and sage, and the occasional lone cottonwood bent permanently by wind. North of the river, the soil went thin fast, more rock than earth, good for grazing if the rain came, a graveyard if it didn't. South of it, the ground held water a little longer, and that difference, just a few inches of black soil, was the kind of difference men killed over without ever admitting it. He camped the first night in a draw where the wind couldn't reach him straight on. He built a fire small, not for comfort, but for coffee, because coffee gives a man the illusion that he's not alone. The stars were hard and white and close enough to hurt you. Coyotes moved somewhere out beyond the ring of light, calling to each other like gossip. He slept with his boots on and his rifle across his chest, and when he woke before dawn, his beard was rimed with frost, even though the calendar said May. By the second day, he'd found what he'd come for, a bend in the red willow, where the bank lifted just enough to stay above flood, where cottonwoods had thrown shade for decades, where the grass grew thicker because the water had to pass close to it on its way down. Country. A spring seeped out of the hillside there, thin, steady, not much, but steady is everything. He dismounted and walked it like a man walking a grave plot, counting his steps without appearing to. The place wasn't empty. No place is. There were old fire rings. There were bones bleached clean. There were tracks he couldn't name, because tracks are a language, and he was still learning the dialect. They will tell you later he picked it by instinct, the way they talk about great men, like they can smell opportunity the way a dog smells fear. But Elias Dunbar didn't trust instinct. Instinct was what got men buried. He trusted water. He trusted slope. He trusted the way willows gather where the ground stays damp. He trusted the evidence. He staked it out with a crude certainty. A 160-acre claim on paper, 1/4 section, a square that existed more cleanly in Washington than it ever would on this broken earth. On the ground, it meant walking boundaries that didn't feel like boundaries. It meant setting corner markers where there was nothing to mark and pretending the wind would respect them. He cut 4 cottonwood stakes, green wood that bled sap on his hands, and drove them in with the back of his axe. The sound of each strike went out into the prairie like a dare, and then came the part the legend skips. The part that looks like nothing in a story and everything in a life. He had to make it legal. The nearest courthouse sat in a town that was less a town than a handful of buildings clustered around a muddy street. The year was still 1883, and the town's name hardly mattered because the towns out here changed names the way drifters change shirts. But there was a post office. There was a saloon with a sawdust floor. There was a general store that smelled of kerosene and bacon and dried apples. And there was a county office with a flag out front and a stove inside that burned soft coal, staining the ceiling black. He rode in on a Thursday because he'd heard, quietly in another man's camp, that the clerk was soberest in the morning and most agreeable after lunch. The clerk's name was Harlan Mott, a man with thin hair and a thick neck who wore a vest that didn't quite button. His hands were ink-stained at the fingertips. He did not look like a villain. Villains rarely do. He looked like a man who knew he had a kind of power and wanted to feel it. The room itself was a coffin of paper, deeds, ledgers, plats, all stacked in sagging shelves. The air smelled of dust and iron and the faint sweetness of spilled whiskey. Elias took his hat off, not out of respect for the law, but because you read men better when they can see your face. Mott didn't look up right away. Letting a man stand is a kind of control. When he finally did, his eyes went to Elias's coat, his boots, his hands. He wasn't measuring character. He was measuring capacity. The capacity to pay, the capacity to endure, the capacity to become a problem. "I'm filing," Elias said. Mott set his pen down slow. The pen mattered, a steel nib and a wooden holder, the kind that scratches when it moves, a sound like a small animal in pain. He asked questions like he'd asked them 1,000 times, questions that were rituals more than inquiries. Name, age, place of birth, description of the land. Elias answered with the steadiness of a man who'd practiced in his head 100 times, because every wrong word out here had a price. The filing fee was $14, plus a few smaller charges that added up like sand in a pocket. Elias laid the money down. He didn't fan it. He didn't hesitate. But there was sweat under his arms despite the cool air, because once you put that money down, you are committed to a lie. The lie that paper can hold a place the way a fence holds cattle. Mott stamped the document. A heavy metal stamp, brought down with a dull final sound. In that moment, in that small room, the Dunbar Ranch was born. Not in the grass, not by the river, not in the work, but in ink. The stamp left a crisp seal, and Elias watched it the way a man watches a brand go on to hide. Ownership, burned into fiber. Was this the beginning of a dream, or the first quiet theft dressed up as process? He left the courthouse with the receipt folded in his pocket like a prayer. Outside, the wind had shifted, and the sky had that flat white look that means weather is coming. He could feel it in his teeth. He rode back out with the paper close to his chest, and if you'd been watching from a distance, you might have thought he was carrying something sacred. But the land didn't change because a clerk hit a stamp. Back at the river bend, the work waited like it always does. He cut cottonwood logs for a lean-to, each stroke of the axe sending the smell of wet wood up into the air. He dug a pit for a root cellar with a shovel that bit into stones and came back ringing. He strung a line to mark where a fence might someday stand, though he didn't have wire yet, only the idea of wire, which is how most empires begin. By the end of that first week, he'd blistered both hands raw. His palms split and bled into the handle. He wrapped them with cloth and kept going because stopping is a luxury. He wasn't alone, even then. Not truly. A man named Oates showed up on the third day, drifting through with a pack horse and a cough that sounded like gravel. Elias paid him £1.25 for 2 days' work, help setting heavier posts, help hauling stones for a hearth. Oates slept outside, even when invited in, pride or fear, hard to tell. He left before dawn on the 5th day without a word, taking nothing but his own hunger with him. No photograph, no mention, just labor spent and gone. By June of 1883, the claim looked like something you could point to. A rough shelter, a fire ring, a patch of turned soil the size of a small room where he planted what he could. Beans, mostly, and a little corn that would fail. He hauled water in buckets, each bucket a small argument against thirst. He watched the horizon, the way a sailor watches sea, measuring clouds for mercy. And already, even then, the first sin was crouched there in the grass with him. The understanding that survival would not be enough. That if he wanted not just to live, but to rule, to make a place that could not be taken, he would need more than work. He would need leverage, more acres, more water, more paper, more men. So when people tell you it began with a handshake, remember the stamp. Remember the clerk. Remember the $14 laid down on a desk that smelled of whiskey and dust. Because the legend begins with a man and a mule and a prayer. But the reality begins with a document, and everything that follows, the cattle, the fences, the wealth, the siege, follows from that quiet moment when the American dream becomes a transaction. They say it started with a handshake on a sunlit porch. A drifter with honest eyes and a strong back offered a stretch of prairie by a generous old-timer who'd seen enough blood and just wanted peace before God took him. It makes a clean story. It lets you believe empires grow the way gardens do, by sunlight and patience. But the truth is colder. The truth is paper. The truth is a stamp in a county courthouse and a clerk with cracked fingernails who knew exactly what a man would pay to be first in line when the land was being turned into property. It was 1883, late spring, when the Dunbar name first came down into that country like a nail driven into green wood. Not the Dunbar Ranch yet. Not the grand word. Just a man. Elias Dunbar, 27 years old by his own saying, older in the eyes, with a coat that smelled of smoke and horse, and a bedroll tied behind a saddle that had seen too many miles. He came up out of the south, along the breaks of a river that ran shallow that year, a gray ribbon over stone. The locals called it the Red Willow, not because it was red, not truly, but because the willows along it turned the color of old wounds in October, and nobody out here forgot the look of a wound. He rode alone for most of it, alone in the way a man can be alone even when he's moving through a country full of other men doing the same math. Because that's what it was now, math. The old talk about open range and God's grass was already thinning. Rail lines were pushing west with schedules and tariffs. Surveyors were coming through with chains and compasses, slicing the horizon into rectangles like butchers with a carcass. The Homestead Act wasn't a story anymore. It was a machine. Put in your time, file your claim, prove it up, pay your fees, and if you were clever or lucky, you could turn a little square of dirt into a future. He carried $38, not a legend, not a fortune. $38 in coin and a few bills, wrapped in oilcloth and tied under his shirt so close to his skin that the sweat from his body had already softened the edges. He had a rifle, an old Springfield that kicked like a mule, and he had a mule too, stubborn and narrow-hipped, hauling a small crate of tools, a post-hole auger, a hammer, a hand saw, a coil of rope, a tin coffee pot blackened on the bottom. What he didn't have was the thing people liked to pretend was enough back then: time. Out here, time wasn't romance, it was survival. You missed one planting, you missed one water season, you missed one filing deadline. The country didn't care what kind of man you were. The geography was unforgiving and exact. To the west, low ridges that looked gentle until you tried to cross them and found the shale underfoot sliding like loose teeth. To the east, miles of open plain, short grass and sage, and the occasional lone cottonwood bent permanently by wind. North of the river, the soil went thin fast, more rock than earth, good for grazing if the rain came, a graveyard if it didn't. South of it, the ground held water a little longer, and that difference, just a few inches of black soil, was the kind of difference men killed over without ever admitting it. He camped the first night in a draw where the wind couldn't reach him straight on. He built a fire small, not for comfort, but for coffee, because coffee gives a man the illusion that he's not alone. The stars were hard and white and close enough to hurt you. Coyotes moved somewhere out beyond the ring of light, calling to each other like gossip. He slept with his boots on and his rifle across his chest. And when he woke before dawn, his beard was rimed with frost even though the calendar said May. By the second day, he'd found what he'd come for, a bend in the red willow, where the bank lifted just enough to stay above flood, where cottonwoods had thrown shade for decades, where the grass grew thicker because the water had to pass close to it on its way down. Country. A spring seeped out of the hillside there, thin, steady, not much, but steady is everything. He dismounted and walked it like a man walking a grave plot, counting his steps without appearing to. The place wasn't empty. No place is. There were old fire rings. There were bones bleached clean. There were tracks he couldn't name, because tracks are a language, and he was still learning the dialect. They will tell you later he picked it by instinct. The way they talk about great men, like they can smell opportunity the way a dog smells fear. But Elias Dunbar didn't trust instinct. Instinct was what got men buried. He trusted water. He trusted slope. He trusted the way willows gather where the ground stays damp. He trusted the evidence. He staked it out with a crude certainty. A 160-acre claim on paper, 1/4 section, a square that existed more cleanly in Washington than it ever would on this broken earth. On the ground, it meant walking boundaries that didn't feel like boundaries. It meant setting corner markers where there was nothing to mark and pretending the wind would respect them. He cut 4 cottonwood stakes, green wood that bled sap on his hands, and drove them in with the back of his axe. The sound of each strike went out into the prairie like a dare, and then came the part the legend skips. The part that looks like nothing in a story and everything in a life. He had to make it legal. The nearest courthouse sat in a town that was less a town than a handful of buildings clustered around a muddy street. The year was still 1883, and the town's name hardly mattered because towns out here change names the way drifters change shirts. But there was a post office. There was a saloon with a sawdust floor. There was a general store that smelled of kerosene and bacon and dried apples. And there was a county office with a flag out front and a stove inside that burned soft coal, staining the ceiling black. He rode in on a Thursday because he'd heard, quietly in another man's camp, that the clerk was soberest in the morning and most agreeable after lunch. The clerk's name was Harlan Mott, a man with thin hair and a thick neck who wore a vest that didn't quite button. His hands were ink-stained at the fingertips. He did not look like a villain. Villains rarely do. He looked like a man who knew he had a kind of power and wanted to feel it. The room itself was a coffin of paper, deeds, ledgers, plats, all stacked in sagging shelves. The air smelled of dust and iron and the faint sweetness of spilled whiskey. Elias took his hat off, not out of respect for the law, but because you red men better when they can see your face. Mott didn't look up right away. Letting a man stand is a kind of control. When he finally did, his eyes went to Elias's coat, his boots, his hands. He wasn't measuring character, he was measuring capacity. The capacity to pay, the capacity to endure, the capacity to become a problem. "I'm filing," Elias said. Mott set his pen down, slow. The pen mattered, a steel nib in a wooden holder, the kind that scratches when it moves, a sound like a small animal in pain. He asked questions like he'd asked them 1,000 times, questions that were rituals more than inquiries. Name, age, place of birth, description of the land. Elias answered with the steadiness of a man who'd practiced in his head 100 times, because every wrong word out here had a price. The filing fee was $14, plus a few smaller charges that added up like sand in a pocket. Elias laid the money down. He didn't fan it. He didn't hesitate. But there was sweat under his arms despite the cool air, because once you put that money down, you are committed to a lie. The lie that paper can hold a place the way a fence holds cattle. Mott stamped the document. A heavy metal stamp, brought down with a dull, final sound. In that moment, in that small room, the Dunbar Ranch was born, not in the grass, not by the river, not in the work, but in ink. The stamp left a crisp seal, and Elias watched it the way a man watches a brand go on to hide. Ownership burned into fiber. Was this the beginning of a dream, or the first quiet theft, dressed up as process? He left the courthouse with the receipt folded in his pocket like a prayer. Outside, the wind had shifted, and the sky had that flat white look that means weather is coming. He could feel it in his teeth. He rode back out with the paper close to his chest, and if you'd been watching from a distance, you might have thought he was carrying something sacred. But the land didn't change because a clerk hit a stamp. Back at the river bend, the work waited like it always does. He cut cottonwood logs for a lean-to, each stroke of the axe sending the smell of wet wood up into the air. He dug a pit for a root cellar with a shovel that bit into stones and came back ringing. He strung a line to mark where a fence might someday stand, though he didn't have wire yet, only the idea of wire, which is how most empires begin. By the end of that first week, he'd blistered both hands raw. His palms split and bled into the handle. He wrapped them with cloth and kept going because stopping is a luxury. He wasn't alone, even then. Not truly. A man named Oates showed up on the third day, drifting through with a pack horse and a cough that sounded like gravel. Elias paid him $1.25 for 2 days' work, help setting heavier posts, help hauling stones for a hearth. Oates slept outside, even when invited in, pride or fear, hard to tell. He left before dawn on the 5th day without a word, taking nothing but his own hunger with him. No photograph, no mention, just labor, spent and gone. By June of 1883, the claim looked like something you could point to, a rough shelter, a fire ring, A patch of turned soil the size of a small room where he planted what he could, beans mostly, and a little corn that would fail. He hauled water in buckets, each bucket a small argument against thirst. He watched the horizon the way a sailor watches sea, measuring clouds for mercy. And already, even then, the first sin was crouched there in the grass with him, the understanding that survival would not be enough, that if he wanted not just to live, but to rule, to make a place that could not be taken, he would need more than work. He would need leverage, more acres, more water, more paper, more men. So when people tell you it began with a handshake, remember the stamp, remember the clerk, remember the $14 laid down on a desk that smelled of whiskey and dust. Because the legend begins with a man and a mule and a prayer. But the reality begins with a document, and everything that follows, the cattle, the fences, the wealth, the siege, follows from that quiet moment when the American dream becomes a transaction. They say a ranch is built with sweat, that if a man works hard enough, if he gets up before light and doesn't quit when his hands split, then the land will meet him halfway. That's the hymn people like to sing. It keeps the story clean. It keeps the sins off the tongue. But the land doesn't meet you halfway. The land takes its half first. And then it watches to see if you've got anything left. It was 1884 when the first real problem walked onto the Dunbar claim wearing boots and a grin. A man named Silas Klein came in from the east with a wagon that looked too new for this country and a team that still carried fat on their ribs. He had a wife, pale and tired, and two boys with hair cut straight across the forehead like their mother had done it with a kitchen knife. He had a plow lashed to the side of the wagon and a roll of canvas for a tent. He had a paper in his pocket, too, folded and refolded until the creases turned white. A notice of claim filed under the same law that had birthed Dunbar's Homestead Act of 1862, amended and leaned on and used up, but still the machine that turned dirt into argument. Klein stopped at the river bend as if he'd been expected. He watered his horses at the seep and let his boys throw stones into the shallows. Elias watched from the doorway of the lean-to, not raising his rifle, not smiling, doing the quiet, measuring men do when they know the future is about to get more crowded. Klein was talkative. That's how he disarmed people. He spoke of Nebraska winters like they were a bad dream he'd finally woken from. He spoke of the railroad as if he'd ridden on the very idea of it into a better life. He said he'd heard there was good ground south of the Red Willow. He said the government wanted families out here. He said it like it was blessing. Elias didn't argue at first. He didn't have the energy for arguments that early in the season. Spring work was already a kind of war. He'd put in a patch of beans again and a narrow strip of corn. And he'd lost half of it to a late frost that came in on April 19, 1884, biting down hard enough to turn the young shoots black. He'd spent 3 days hauling rock out of his planting rows, his back aching, his fingers numb from handling stone and cold mud. He'd traded for 2 heifers that month, $12 each, paid in cash and in labor, and he'd been watching them like a man watching a savings account that might wander off at night. Klein's eyes kept drifting to the seep, not to the house, not to the field, not to the rough corral made of deadfall, to the water, because water was what made a claim more than a line on paper. Water was what kept cattle alive. Water was what let a family stay long enough to prove up and make the government's promise real. Klein asked, casual as a man asking for a match, if the spring was spoken for. Elias told him the truth as he understood it. The spring was on his claim. He had filed it. He had worked it. He had dug and cleared and built beside it. He'd paid the 14+ filing fee and the smaller charges that came with it. He had a receipt dated May 1883. He didn't say the receipt like it was a weapon, but it was. Klein laughed softly, like men do when they're trying to keep their temper from showing. He said he wasn't looking for trouble. He said there was enough land for everybody. He said the government didn't give one man a whole creek. And that was where the truth began to show its teeth. Because, no, the government didn't give one man a creek, but the country was full of men learning how to take one anyway. Within a week, Klein had moved his wagon downriver and set his tent on a bench where the grass grew tall, not on Elias's quarter section, not exactly, close enough that you could feel him in the air. He started digging a shallow diversion from a little side channel that fed the red willow, scratching at the bank with a spade and his own stubbornness. He worked early and late, as if speed might make the law arrive in his favor. Elias rode into town on May 3rd, 1884. He went straight past the saloon and into the county office, where the coal stove still smoked even though the days were warming. Harlan Mott was there again, the clerk, his vest still straining at the buttons. The ledgers were thicker now, more claims, more lines. The air smelled the same, dust, ink, and the sweet ghost of whiskey. Elias laid his receipt on the counter. He asked carefully about the spring, about whether a man could divert water that crossed another man's claim, about whether proximity gave rights, about whether someone could file a second claim that boxed his in. Mott didn't answer like a judge. He answered like a man who understood leverage. He said the law didn't speak plainly out here because the law was written by men who'd never had to melt snow to drink. He said if Elias wanted certainty, he'd need a survey, a proper one, with a licensed man holding the chain and a witness signing off. That would cost money. $40, Mott said, as if it were nothing. $40 might as well have been $400 to Elias in that moment. It was more than he'd brought into the territory the year before. It was nearly the value of his 2 heifers. Elias asked if there was another way. Mott looked at him long enough to let silence do its work. Then he slid the receipt back and said there were informal ways. Men who could talk to Klein, men with badges sometimes, men without them more often. But the world out here ran on relationships as much as statutes, and relationships, like everything else, had a price. Outside, Elias stood on the boardwalk and listened to the town, a hammer on a roof, a wagon wheel squealing, laughter from the saloon like warm air spilling out. He could smell frying fat from a back kitchen. He felt, for the first time since he'd arrived, the shape of the trap. Land was cheap to claim, expensive to keep. He went into the general store instead. He bought a spool of barbed wire, just one, because that's what his money could stand. It cost $3.75. He bought a sack of flour for $2.10 and a tin of coffee for 65 cents because pride doesn't feed you. He traded for fence staples with a man who wanted labor more than cash. The storekeeper wrote numbers in a ledger while Elias watched the ink form, dark and permanent, like another kind of brand. Back on the claim, he drove posts in along the edge where he knew Klein's boys liked to wander. He worked the wire out with cold fingers, stretching it tight, stapling it down, his hands bleeding when the barbs slipped. Barbed wire was new enough then that it still felt like a trick, thin metal that could stop a man and turn cattle like a wall. But one spool only ran so far. It was a gesture more than a defense. Klein watched from the bank. He didn't cross the line, not yet. He didn't need to. He had planted his own corn. He had dug his own shallow trench. He had his own claim paperwork, filed on April 28, 1884. Elias found that out later when he paid Mott 50 cents just to look at the ledger page. 50 cents to see your own future on paper. 50 cents for the privilege of knowing you had a neighbor you hadn't asked for. The tension between them wasn't a gunfight. Not then. It was worse. It was daily proximity. It was the constant awareness that both men were right in their own minds and that neither one could afford to be generous. One afternoon in June, Elias found his 2 heifers standing downriver, belly deep in water, chewing contentedly on grass that grew thick by Klein's trench. He could see the fresh-cut banks where the water had been redirected. He could see Klein's shovel marks, neat and deliberate. He could also see something else, the water at his own seep, running thinner than it had the week before. Elias stood there a long time, looking at those animals, feeling the heat on his neck, hearing the river's thin talk over stones. He could walk down and cut Klein's trench. A few minutes with a spade. The land would heal it by morning. He could do it in the dark. Nobody would see. Or he could ride into town again and spend money he didn't have on a survey he couldn't afford, chasing certainty through paperwork that moved slower than hunger. He didn't cut the trench that day. He led his heifers back upriver, one hand on the rope, feeling their weight, feeling how easily they could become someone else's asset with a single night's theft. That night he sat at his table and counted what he had, 160 acres on paper. 2 heifers. A patch of beans, 1 spool of wire, 33 cartridges left in the box after he'd checked the rifle and found himself counting bullets like prayers. And he understood, in a way that settled deep and quiet, that work was only half the story. The other half was control. Control of water, control of boundaries, control of men. Was he going to be the kind of man who let the creek be shared and hoped the world would be fair? Or was he going to learn what the open range was already teaching everyone who survived it, how to close a fist around something living and call it law? They tell it like the range was a kind of Eden, grass as far as the eye could stand, cattle drifting like clouds, men living light, owing nothing to anybody but their own stamina. They say the open range was freedom. But freedom is just a word men use when they don't yet have enough to lose. The truth was that the open range was a temporary condition, like good weather. And the moment the land began to mean money in a way a bank could understand, the range started closing, not with speeches, not with laws read aloud, with wire, with receipts, with men waking in the dark to do ugly work quietly. It was the summer of 1887 when Elias Dunbar finally admitted to himself that a claim wasn't a claim until it could be defended without him standing on it every hour. He'd survived 4 seasons now, 4 rounds of mud and drought and early frost and the thin hunger of spring. He'd added cattle slow the way a man adds boards to a house, one at a time, hoping the roof holds. He had 47 hit by his own count that July. 47, each one marked in his ledger with a notch of pencil and a note on color and temperament, like personality could protect property. He'd bought some. He'd traded labor for others. He'd found 2 strays in a storm gulch in March and branded them with a mark he'd designed himself, 2 bars and a hooked tail, heated in a fire until the iron went dull orange and the air around it shimmered. He had done it quick, because quick is the only mercy a brand offers. The calf bawled. The smell came up, burnt hair and hot hide, and it stayed in his nose for days. There were other marks out here, older marks backed by men with more horses and better rifles and friends in town, men who'd run cattle long before Elias put a stake in the red willow ground. To them, Dunbar wasn't building a ranch. He was taking range, stealing grass by turning it into private. That summer, the grass looked good from a distance and mean up close, short and tough, like it had learned not to waste itself. The red willow ran low even in July, the stones showing through in the bends. Elias could feel the country tightening again. He'd seen what drought did to a man. He'd seen what a neighbor would do for water. He had no intention of letting another Silas Klein reach into his throat. So he rode into town on August 14th, 1887, with dust on his hat brim and sweat dried into salt on the collar of his shirt. He went past the county office, past Harlan Mott and his paper kingdom, and straight to the rail siding where freight got dropped like bones. A flat car sat there with stacks of lumber and 2 crates of stovepipe. There were barrels of nails. There were sacks of salt. And there, sitting in the shade of the depot, was what Elias had come for, coils of barbed wire stacked like sleeping snakes. He spoke with the agent, a man named Rourke, who kept a pencil behind his ear and his eyes half-lidded like he didn't want to be impressed by anything. Elias didn't beg. Begging makes a man smell weak. He asked prices. He asked weight. He asked what it would cost to have it shipped down river if he needed more later. Rourke quoted him $4.90 a spool, 80 rods per spool, enough wire to stretch 1,120 feet if you didn't waste any and if your posts were already set. Elias did the math in his head, because that's what you do when you don't have room for fantasy. He bought 30 spools. That number mattered. 30 spools meant commitment. 30 spools meant he was no longer just surviving, he was making a statement. The bill came to $147, not counting staples. Rourke wrote it out on a slip and waited, not moving, letting the silence pressure Elias into revealing whether he was solvent or foolish. Elias paid $50 cash, the last of what he'd saved, and signed for the rest on credit with the storekeeper as his backstop. That was the moment the ranch took on a second kind of stake, debt. A thing you can't see on the ground, but it fences you in all the same. He hauled the wire home over 2 days, loading spools into his wagon until the axles groaned. The wire sang when it moved, a high, thin whine like something alive. When he got back to the river bend, he set the spools under canvas and stood there a long time, looking at them, understanding what they meant, understanding that every mile of wire he stretched would be read by someone as an insult. He started at dawn the next morning. He'd cut posts all spring, cottonwood where he could get it, cedar where he had to, posts he'd stacked in rows like grave markers waiting their turn. He spaced them 12 feet apart, not because it was perfect, but because it was what his body could keep consistent. He augured holes in stubborn soil, the handle biting his palms, his shoulders burning. He tamped dirt around each post with the butt of a shovel until the ground felt locked again. And then the wire. He wore gloves at first, but gloves slow you down. By noon, he'd taken them off and accepted the cuts. Wire doesn't forgive. The barbs catch your skin and pull it open in quiet little truths. Blood dots the metal. Sweat runs into the cuts and makes them sting bright enough to make you curse out loud to nobody. He stretched 3 strands, one low for calves, one mid for cows, one high for men who thought climbing was clever. He stapled it down with galvanized staples he'd bought for $1.35 a pound, driving each one with quick, precise blows, the hammer ringing across the flats. He worked with a steady fury because he knew that a half-finished fence was worse than none. A half-finished fence invites argument. By the end of the week, he'd enclosed 160 acres tight. His original quarter section turned from paper into physical fact. A square you could walk, a boundary you could touch. He stood at a corner post in the evening, looking down the wire line as it disappeared into the grass, the metal catching the last light and throwing it back cold. The ranch looked smaller suddenly, contained, safer, and more vulnerable at the same time. The first night someone tested it, there was no gunfire, just the soft sound of wire flexing in the dark. He heard it from the house, a faint twang like a harp string plucked badly. He didn't light a lantern. Light makes you a target. He eased the rifle up and stepped outside into a night so clear the stars looked sharpened. He walked slow along the fence line, listening. At the north stretch, near the draw where the coyotes ran, he found it, a section cut clean, the 3 strands snipped with fencing pliers and peeled back like a mouth forced open. No tracks in the hard ground, just the faint scuff of hooves where someone had pushed cattle through. The barbs were bent. One staple lay in the dirt like a tooth. He knelt and touched the cut ends. Fresh. The metal still held the warmth of recent handling, or maybe that was just his imagination reaching for certainty. He repaired it before dawn, working by feel, using his fingers as eyes. When the sun finally came, it came up on a fence that looked whole again. But he knew it wasn't, not really. Once you cut wire, you've declared something. You've said, I see you. I'm not impressed. The next day he rode to the Klein place, not into Klein's yard, not across any line that could be called trespass, just near enough to be heard if Klein came out. He sat on his horse and waited, hat low, rifle scabbarded, posture calm. Klein appeared after a long minute, wiping his hands on his trousers like he'd been fixing something. He didn't ask why Elias was there. He already knew. Men don't ask questions when the answer is obvious and ugly. Elias didn't accuse him. Accusations are a kind of begging, too. He simply said, quiet as a man discussing weather, that his fence had been cut. Klein smiled without humor. He said the range was for everyone. He said cattle wander. He said a man can't fence the wind. He said, and this was the part that mattered, that some folks in town didn't like the way Dunbar was taking over, as if Elias were an invading army and not a starving man with a mortgage, as if 160 acres were an empire. Elias looked at him a long moment and then rode away, because there was nothing to win in that conversation, only things to lose. That evening, he sat at his table with the ledger open. He wrote down the cost of wire, $145. He wrote down the staples. He wrote down the day the fence was cut. He wrote it all in neat lines because neat lines make chaos feel manageable. Outside, the cattle moved in the darkness, hooves soft in grass. Somewhere far off, A rider passed on the old trail, not stopping, just reminding him that the world beyond his fence was still there and still watching. And in the weeks that followed, the fence held, mostly. A cut here, a staple pried loose there. The kind of harassment that drains a man the way drought drains a creek. Slow, steady, meant to teach you that resistance costs more than surrender. Elias began to understand what the old ranchers had known all along, that to hold land, you needed more than wire and will. You needed friends with badges. You needed men willing to ride for you. You needed influence in town where paper lived, and influence, real influence, rarely came from sweat alone. So what happens when a man's hands and his fence posts aren't enough? When the range turns political and every coil of wire demands a new kind of protection? Does he keep fighting with muscle and metal? Or does he step into the quieter arena where power is bought with signatures, interest rates, and the cold promise of other people's money? They say the Dunbars got rich the old way, by riding hard, sleeping cold, and dragging calves out of snowdrifts with their bare hands. They say the ranch became an empire because Elias Dunbar could outwork the weather. The truth is, weather can't be outworked, not for long, and empires don't rise on sweat alone. They rise on debt. They rise on paper that smells like ink and coal smoke. They rise on men in town who never lifted a post but can lift your whole life with a signature. It was February 6, 1891. When Elias rode into town with frost on his mustache and a list in his pocket that he'd written the night before by lamplight. The list wasn't dreams. It was needs, salt, wire, 2 new wagons if he could swing it, 1 hired hand through spring, and, most important, cash enough to buy the Hendricks place before someone else did. The Hendricks place was 1,280 acres of broken pasture west of the Red Willow, cut by 2 shallow draws that held water after rains and held grass a week longer in the dry months. Hendricks had died in November, thrown from a horse, dragged 50 yards, and found with his mouth full of dirt. His widow was leaving. The land was going to auction in 30 days. Elias knew the truth of auctions. The loudest bidder isn't always the richest. He's just the one with money that day. Elias had cattle now, 312 head by his winter count, branded and half wild, living proof he'd survived long enough to become visible. Visibility was dangerous. It drew envy. It drew attention from men who'd once cut his wire and now saw a bigger target. But it also meant something else. Collateral, a word that turns animals into numbers. He tied his horse outside the bank and went in. The bank was a narrow building with a false front and a real smell of money, dust, old paper, and the faint bite of metal from the stove. A brass spittoon sat by the door, dented like it had taken kicks from impatient boots. The man behind the desk wore a clean shirt and a watch chain. He looked like he'd never had manure under his nails, but his eyes were quick and hard. "Morning, Mr. Dunbar," he said like they were friends. His name was Clarence Vale, and he had the kind of polite voice men use when they're about to tighten a rope. He gestured to a chair that creaked when Elias sat. On the desk was a ledger, opened wide, a pen resting across it like a small weapon. The ink bottle was capped. Nothing moved until agreement did. Vale asked about the winter. He asked about calf losses. He asked about the price Elias expected in spring, not because he cared, because he was measuring risk the way a rancher measures a sick cow, by weight, by breath, by whether it'll stand. Elias answered in the plain numbers because numbers were the only language this man respected. He'd lost 19 head to the hard freeze in December. He'd sold 40 steers in October at $3.90 per hundredweight, a bad price, but a necessary one. And the money was gone as fast as it came. Feed, wire repairs, store credit. He expected spring prices closer to $4.50 if the rail buyers showed up hungry, and if the rumors about Eastern demand were true. Vail listened without blinking. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a printed form, edges sharp, paper thick. He set it down between them like a boundary line. "How much are you asking for?" Vail said. Elias hesitated just long enough to feel shame prick at him, because asking was its own kind of surrender. Then he said it anyway. $3,000. There it was, $3,000, an amount so large it didn't feel like money, it felt like weather, something you endure. Vail didn't react. He'd heard bigger numbers from men who later went broke. He asked what Elias would put up. Elias said the cattle. Elias said the land, his original 160 acres fenced, plus the additional parcels he'd pieced together since, 3 to 20 acres, bought from a man who'd failed, 160 acres, acquired when a neighbor paid a debt with dirt. In total, 640 acres, with improvements, plus rights, informal but understood, to water access along the Red Willow Bend. Vail nodded. He reached for the ink bottle, uncapped it, and the smell rose, sharp and alive. He dipped the pen. The nib scratched when he wrote, a sound that made Elias's jaw tighten. Vail's hand moved with ease, as if he were merely recording something that already existed. "Interest will be 10%, Vail said, like he was talking about the temperature. 10%. That was what money cost in a country where uncertainty was the only certainty. Elias did the math in his head and felt it land in his chest. $300 a year, just for the privilege of owing. Vail kept writing. He added terms, he added dates, he added consequences, a lien on livestock, a lien on land, payments due twice a year, June 1st and December furrow, because the bank understood ranch seasons better than most preachers did. If a payment was missed, the note could be called. That meant a man could lose everything, not because he worked less, but because a storm hit at the wrong time. Elias stared at the pen. He watched the ink soak into paper fibers like blood into cloth. Outside, a wagon rolled by, iron rims groaning on frozen dirt. A man laughed somewhere. Life went on, unaware of how fragile it was. Vail slid the paper across with the pen. "Sign there," he said. Elias took the pen. It was lighter than his hammer and heavier than his rifle, because it didn't just move in his hand, it moved the future. The ink came out smooth. His name took shape, the letters a little cramped, his hand stiff from cold and from the weight of what he was doing. He signed Elias Dunbar, as if he were carving it into stone. Vail blotted it with a square of paper like a priest wiping up spilled wine. Then he stamped it. Thunk, soft but final. And just like that, Elias had his $3,000, not in a sack, not in coins, in a bank draft with Vail's signature and the promise that other men would honor it. Elias didn't linger. He left the bank with that draft folded in his pocket, pressed flat against his ribs. The day had warmed to a pale sun, but the air still cut. He crossed the street to the rail office, because money without transport is just weight, and transport was the artery of this new world. The railroad agent, Rourke's replacement, a younger man with slick hair, met him behind a counter stained with tobacco juice. Elias wanted freight terms. He wanted predictability. He wanted a rate he could plan around, not a number that shifted with every rumor out of Chicago. They talked in cents and pounds like men gambling with other people's hunger. The agent quoted him $1.05 per 100 pounds to ship cattle east to the yards, then added a handling fee that wasn't called a bribe but lived in the same neighborhood. Elias pushed back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just laid the bank draft on the counter where the agent could see it. Money is persuasive, even when it's borrowed. The agent relented a little, $0.95 per 100 pounds plus the fee. Elias agreed because in a hard world, you don't wait for perfect. You take what you can and you build from there. He walked back out into the thin winter sun and stood for a moment on the boardwalk, listening to the town breathe. He could smell coal smoke. He could smell horses. He could smell frying fat. He could also smell the future, faint, metallic, and inevitable. With that note signed, he wasn't just a man fighting neighbors and weather anymore. He was tied into a system of rail lines and interest rates, a system that could make him larger than any fence line, or crush him without ever drawing a gun. He rode home with $3,000 of borrowed power in his pocket and a 1,280-acre purchase waiting like a door half open. The creek would still run low, the wind would still cut, men would still cut his wire in the dark, but now, behind all of that, there was another presence, quiet, patient, and unforgiving, a bank that would want its due, in ink if possible, in flesh if necessary. So tell me, was this loan a lifeline thrown to a struggling rancher, or was it the first brick in something grander, the first step from survival into spectacle, from a lean-to by the red willow to a house that would make the whole county stare? They say the old ranchers hated town, said it was where men got soft and where money made you stupid, said a real outfit lived and died by what it could grow and what it could rope, and that anything you couldn't touch wasn't worth trusting. But the truth is, the Dunbar Ranch didn't become a ranch in the way people mean it. It became a balance sheet. It became a set of columns, a story told in ink strokes and interest rates. And in the quiet way a man's fate can be decided by another man who never once smelled wet hide. On March 9th, 1891, the Hendricks auction happened under a sky the color of tin. Not raining, not snowing, just threatening. The courthouse was a squat brick building with a bell in the tower that didn't ring for land, only for fires and funerals. Inside, the air held that mix of wet wool and old varnish. Boots scuffed on plank floors. Men talked low like they were in church, except their prayers had price tags. Elias Dunbar stood near the back with his hat in his hands. He could feel the bank draft in his coat pocket like a hot coal. $3,000 borrowed at 10%, a note pinned to him with June 1st and December 1st written into it like commandments, the kind of money that could buy land or bury you, depending on how the season leaned. The widow Hendricks sat in the front row with her jaw set, black dress tight at the wrists. She didn't cry. She'd already done her crying, and it hadn't changed anything. Beside her, a lawyer turned pages in a folder, the paper whispering, "He looked bored," which is how power often looks when it's deciding other people's lives. The auctioneer started with a joke nobody laughed at, then cleared his throat and began calling numbers. The land was described like meat, 1,280 acres, 2 draws, improvements included, water rights customary. Customary! That's how they dressed up the fact that water out here was more about muscle than statute. A man could say customary and pretend it was law. Bids came in slow at first, 1-800-2000, a pause that felt like a dare. Elias didn't move. He watched. He listened for who was bidding, because bids are voices, and voices have histories. Two of the men cutting in were the same ones who'd once smiled at Silas Klein's talk about shared range. They were older now, heavier, better dressed. They didn't cut wire with their own hands anymore. They had boys and hired riders for that. When the bidding hit $12,600, Elias raised his hand and said, plain as a man ordering coffee, $2,700. The room shifted, not loud, just the small movement of attention. A few heads turned. Somebody murmured his name the way people murmur a storm. The auctioneer nodded and rolled on, calling for more. One of the older men countered at $2,800. Elias didn't answer right away. He let the silence settle. He could feel the sweat under his arms, even in that cold room. He could feel the weight of every dollar, not as currency, but as time. Years of hauling stone, years of fixing fence, years of watching the creek and the sky like they were gods. Then he said, 3,000, a clean number, a line in the sand. The other man hesitated. The room waited with him because hesitation is contagious. He looked toward the widow, toward the lawyer, toward the ceiling, as if the building itself might tell him what the land was worth. And then, because pride is expensive, he shook his head like he didn't care and let it go. Sold, the auctioneer said, and the gavel cracked down hard enough to sound like a rifle shot in that wooden room. Elias didn't exhale in relief. Relief is what you feel when something ends. This wasn't ending. This was beginning. He walked forward, signed papers that smelled faintly of glue and dust, and handed over the bank draft. The lawyer checked the signature like he was checking a wound. The widow watched, without blinking. When it was done, she stood and left without looking back, as if the land had already become someone else's dream and someone else's curse. Outside, the wind cut along the street, the same town, the same boardwalk, the same coal smoke. But Elias felt different in his bones. He'd just turned borrowed money into ground. He'd just expanded his world by 180 acres in the space of a few minutes. A ranch doesn't grow in grass. It grows in moments like that, when ink decides where a man can stand. Back home, the work didn't change to match the scale. It just multiplied. He rode the Hendricks boundary 2 days later, April 1791, with a coil of rope, a notebook, and a mouthful of grit. The corners weren't obvious. The old markers were half-rotted stakes and piles of stone that looked like any other piles of stone unless you knew what to look for. He found one corner post, leaned over like a tired man. He straightened it and tamped earth around it with his boot heel, feeling the ground resist and then give, as if it didn't want to accept anyone's claim. He took notes the way a banker takes notes. Draw holds water late. South bench grass thick. Old corral broken. Not poetry, inventory. At night, he sat at his table and opened a ledger, real ledger paper now, bought in town for 85 cents. And he wrote down what he owed and what he had. He wrote Hendricks, 180 acres in one line. In another he wrote bank note, $3,000 of 10%. He wrote payment due, June 1st. He underlined it twice. The underlines looked like bars on a jail cell. And then he did something that would have been unthinkable in 1883 when he arrived with $38 and a mule. He started planning around the railroad. On May 17, 1891, he drove a load of steers, 40 head, toward the rail siding, each animal averaging around 1,050 pounds, hide tight, eyes nervous. The drive took 2 days because cattle don't care about your schedule. They care about water and grass and the space between them and the next animal's horns. He slept out with the herd under a sky full of thin stars and listened to them breathe and shift in the dark. He could smell their bodies warming the night air. He could smell manure and sage. He could smell the money they represented and the debt riding on their backs. At the siding, the railroad agent met him with a clipboard and a pencil. No handshake, just procedure. The freight rate was written there in black, $0.95 per 100 pounds, plus the handling fee that everyone pretended wasn't a bribe because naming things makes them ugly. Elias watched his steers pushed up the chute into the cars, hooves slipping on the ramp, men shouting, the animals bawling, the whole process loud and brutal and efficient. A rancher's work, reduced to a shipment. When the last gate clanged shut, the agent asked for the brand registry number. Elias gave it. The agent wrote it down without looking up. This was how the new world worked. The ranch became a set of identifiers, a set of weights, a set of promised dollars that would arrive weeks later after the stockyards took their cut. And when the check finally came, June 19, 1891, it wasn't a sack of gold. It was a piece of paper with figures on it. The gross was good. The deductions were cruel. Yardage fees, commission, rail charges, a line-item world where every service had a mouth. Elias held that check in his hand and felt something settle. Not joy, not victory, understanding. He could pay the bank on June 1st because he'd already sold smaller lots to a local buyer and scraped together the interest like a man scraping frost off a window. He could keep the note alive. He could keep the ranch expanding. But only if he kept feeding the ledger, only if he kept turning grass into cattle and cattle into paper and paper back into land. That summer, he hired 2 hands for $8 a month each and felt the bitterness of it, because he remembered what it felt like to be the man paid, not the man paying. He bought another 20 spools of wire at $4.90 a spool and started fencing the Hendricks draws, not because he loved fences, but because fenced water was control. He began to show up in town more often, not out of pleasure, but because the ranch now had a second home there, in the bank vault, in the railroad office, in the courthouse ledger, where his name sat like a claim on the future. The Dunbar Ranch was still mud and sweat and blistered hands, but it was also something else now, an idea financed into reality, a machine built to outlast weather by binding itself to markets and contracts and men like Clarence Vale who would never ride a fence line but could still decide whether it lived. And once a man learns that kind of power, once he sees that ink can move more earth than any shovel, what does he build next with it? Does he keep living small on a big spread? Or does he start laying the first boards of something that looks less like survival and more like a palace? They say the Dunbars lived plain, that even when the cattle multiplied and the bank stopped looking at them like a bad bet, they still ate off tin and slept with one eye open, like the prairie could revoke their comfort at any moment. Folks like that story because it flatters them. It says wealth didn't change the man. It says the man stayed pure. But money doesn't make you evil. It makes you honest. It reveals what you already wanted and what you were already willing to do to get it. And when the Dunbar outfit finally had enough cash moving through its hands to dream beyond survival, the dream didn't look like humility. It looked like a house. It was September 18th, 1903, when Elias Dunbar stood on the bare patch of ground just above the Red Willow Bend and watched a surveyor's string tremble in the wind. The grass had been cut close, scalped down to dirt and roots. Stakes sat in the earth like small bones, each one flagged with a scrap of cloth. The morning was cool but not cold, and the air smelled of damp soil and old smoke, the kind of smell you get when summer is dying slow and the nights start biting again. Elias held his hat in his hands, turning the brim without knowing he was doing it. He was 47 now. He had the heavy look of men who've spent 2 decades squinting into weather. His hands were scarred and thick, but his boots were better than they used to be. The leather wasn't cracked through. The soles had been resoled in town. There's a point where a man either admits he has money or keeps pretending he doesn't. Elias was crossing that line, and he could feel it in the way his own body didn't quite trust the idea. A carpenter named Palmer stood with him, a small man with a big mustache and a notebook full of neat figures. Palmer had come out from the railroad towns, one of those men the West created, half craftsman and half opportunist. He spoke in measurements, the way preachers speak in verses. 12-foot walls, a pitched roof steep enough to shed snow, a foundation of stone because frost heave will tear a wood sill apart like it's nothing. Palmer pointed with the pencil, tapping the air where rooms would be. Here would be the parlor, here a proper kitchen with a real stove, not the old iron box that smoked and ate wood like a starving animal, but a cast iron range shipped in by rail, black as a bruise and heavy enough that it took 4 men to drag it into place. Here, 2 bedrooms upstairs and a narrow hall with windows that would look out over the bottomland. Palmer talked about windows like they were a kind of luxury religion. 14 panes on the south side alone, glass ordered from back east, the kind of glass that didn't ripple so badly it made the world look drunk. Elias listened and nodded, but his eyes kept straying down to the river. Water was still the first fact of his life. He could hear it under Palmer's words, the thin murmur over stones. He remembered melting snow in a pot and tasting iron. He remembered counting bullets. He remembered the first wire cut in the dark. And now he was standing here talking about parlors. There was a paper to sign. Palmer had it folded in his coat pocket, protected from sweat. He pulled it out and smoothed it against a board he carried for just this purpose. The ink was already on it, lines, numbers, and a place for a name. The cost was written plain, tariff of $180 for labor and basic materials. That did not include the milled lumber itself, because milled lumber was a separate deal, and the nearest yard that could supply it was 70 miles away by wagon road if the creek crossings didn't wash out. It did not include the freight charges either, because nothing in this country moved without somebody taking a cut. Palmer's pencil tapped the number, not hard, just enough to remind Elias that it was real. $2,480, a sum that would have sounded like insanity to the man who arrived in 1883 with $38 and a mule. Elias took the pen, not a fancy pen, a steel nib dipped into a bottle, the same kind of writing instrument Harlan Mott had used when he stamped the first claim. The nib scratched slightly when Elias set it down, and he could smell the ink, sharp, almost sweet. He signed slow. not because he was unsure how to write his own name, but because he understood what signing meant. It meant committing the ranch's future to something that could burn, something that could be shot full of holes, something that could make men talk. When the contract was done, the work began, and that's the part the legends always skip, because it doesn't fit the romance. A house doesn't rise out of a man's will. It rises out of other men's backs. In the first week of October 1903, the wagons started coming, lumber stacked high, boards planed and squared, smelling of pine pitch and rail yard smoke. Nails came in kegs, 50-pound kegs that clanked when you rolled them. Window frames arrived wrapped in burlap. So did the glass, each pane separated by thin strips of wood like a fragile promise. Elias's foreman, Tom Oates, older now and still coughing sometimes, still there because the world doesn't always let people leave, counted everything as it came in, ticking off items on Palmer's list like they were cattle. There were 8 men on the build at first, 2 carpenters, a stone man, 3 general laborers, and 2 boys too young to grow beards, but old enough to haul water and carry lumber until their shoulders bruised. They were paid $2 a day if they were skilled, Walmart 25 if they weren't, and they worked from first light to last because daylight was the only mercy a job site gets. The cook, Rosa, hired out of town, worked longer than any of them for $15 a month, and her food, standing over a stove that turned the air greasy and hot, even when the wind outside cut cold. The foundation stones were hauled from a draw west of the Hendricks parcel, rocks pried loose with bars and loaded by hand. The stone man set them one at a time, each rock seeded into mortar with a dull, patient thud. The sound carried in the morning air like slow hammering on a coffin lid. The men's breath rose white and vanished. Their hands split. Their knuckles bled into the mortar, turning it faintly pink in places until someone wiped it away and pretended not to see. And while the house rose, the ranch did not pause. Cattle still needed riding. Fences still needed mending. Water still needed watching. The work that fed this dream kept grinding on beneath it. By November 11th, 1903, Veterans Day wasn't called that yet. It was just another date on a calendar that most men didn't own. The roof timbers went up. The ridge beam was hoisted with ropes, men leaning back with their boots dug into dirt, faces red, muscles corded. The beam creaked as it rose, and for a moment it hung there against the pale sky like a question. Is this civilization, or is this vanity? Elias stood below and watched, hands in his pockets, jaw tight. He didn't lift the beam. He didn't swing the hammer. Not anymore. That was another truth money reveals. The man at the center becomes the man who watches other men do the work and tells himself his watching is leadership. And the house changed the way people approached him. Town men started riding out just to see it. A county commissioner in a clean coat came in late November and stood in the half-finished parlor with his boots on the new floorboards, talking about roads and development as if he were blessing the place. A judge stopped by on December 3rd, 1903, and accepted coffee without asking who had poured it. He spoke of property lines and order and the value of respectable families on the frontier. Elias listened, smiled when he was supposed to, and learned what the new game sounded like. Polite words that meant favors. At night, when the workers were asleep and the wind moved through the cottonwoods like a hand through dry hair, the house sat there unfinished and huge, The lantern light from inside made the windows glow like eyes. Elias would stand on the porch framing, just planks then, not yet a porch, and look out over his bottomland and hear cattle shifting in the dark. He could feel pride trying to rise in him. He could also feel something else, exposure, because a palace on the prairie is a beacon. It says, plainly, there is something here worth taking. So tell me, was this house a home built for warmth and lineage, a hard-earned shelter against a hard-earned world? Or was it the first public declaration that the Dunbars had become something else entirely, something like royalty, in a country that hates kings and loves to watch them bleed? They say the Dunbar Ranch reached its height like a mountain summit, earned, clean, wind-swept. A place a man climbs by grit alone, and when he stands there at the top, he can finally breathe. They say the Dunbars were untouchable then, too big to fail, too rooted to move. But nothing in this country is untouchable. There's only what can't be taken yet, and the top isn't a summit. It's a ledge, a narrow place where you can see farther and fall farther than you ever could down below. On October 3rd, 1917, a cold rain came in sideways off the north ridge and turned the yard into a soup of clay and manure, the kind of rain that doesn't wash things clean. It just rearranges the filth. Men moved through it with their collars up and their hats pulled low, boots sucking at the ground with each step. A wagon stood tilted under the weight of wet hides, and the air smelled like iron and damp wool and the sharp, sweet edge of blood. They were shipping that morning, not a few steers, not a neighborly lot, a real movement, cattle pushed out of the holding pens in waves, chutes clanging, men shouting hoarse, horses sidestepping and rolling their eyes. The count had been taken the night before in the ledger room, lamplight on paper, pencil smudges on fingers. 15,000 head on the Dunbar books that season. 15,000, give or take, spread across a quilt of grass that by then measured near 60,000 acres, if you added up the deeded ground, the leases, and the pieces acquired through debt and marriage and quiet courthouse work. The old lean-to by the Red Willow was long gone. In its place stood the big house, now finished and lived in, with glass windows that held the gray day like it was trapped. A porch wide enough for a dozen men to stand on without brushing shoulders. A parlor that smelled of cigar smoke and lemon oil. And behind it all, the ranch buildings, barns, bunkhouses, corrals, built not for romance, but for throughput. Work made efficient, work made scalable. Elias Dunbar was 61 that fall. He did not ride the pens anymore. He stood under the eave of the shipping shed with a coat that had been brushed clean and a ledger tucked under one arm like scripture. His hands were still scarred, still thick, but the scars had become relics, proof of a past he no longer lived in. He watched men do what he once did, and he watched them the way a man watches a machine he owns, for performance, not for pain. The invisible workforce was there in full, 48 men on payroll in peak season, riders, fence hands, a foreman, a bookkeeper who could write in a clean, educated hand, and cooks who fed them all from before light until after dark. Wages had risen with the times, but not with the profits. Most of the riders made $35 a month plus board. The foreman made $60. The bookkeeper made $75 and was considered lucky because he kept his hands dry. They slept in bunkhouses that smelled of sweat and damp leather, coughing through the night when the smoke from the stove settled wrong. They rode in rain that turned to sleet on the high ground and in heat that blistered the backs of their necks in July. Nobody would carve their names into the Dunbar legend, but the ranch ran on their bodies all the same. A rail agent arrived from town just after sunrise, collar up, notebook in hand, the paper already softening from the wet. He was polite in the way a man is polite when he knows he represents the artery your livelihood runs through. He read off freight terms like a sermon. Rates had shifted again. War year. The country was hungry, and the government had contracts out like bait. The agent mentioned a shipment scheduled for the Omaha yards and another destined farther east. He mentioned dates and car counts. He mentioned urgency because it was 1917 and the world was burning across the ocean, and America had stepped into it in April like a man stepping into a river he doesn't understand. Beef was suddenly more than beef. It was patriotism. It was supply lines. It was paperwork stamped with eagles and signed by men who never saw a steer. There was a contract to sign that morning, brought out in a leather folder and held under the shed to keep it from soaking through. The paper had a government look to it, thick, official, confident. A purchase agreement for 2,000 head of finished steers. Delivery by November 1st, 1917, at $50 per head, $52 each. A number that made the ranch hands glance sideways when they heard it, because they knew what they were paid in a month, and they knew what a single animal would fetch. The man who presented it wasn't a soldier. He was a civilian buyer, wearing a clean coat and city boots, already rimmed with mud. He held a fountain pen that looked out of place in that wet yard like a piece of jewelry brought to a knife fight. He spoke with the calm authority of someone who believed the country belonged to him because he could name its mechanisms. Elias didn't sign immediately. He had learned over decades that the pause before a signature is where power lives. He asked about inspection standards. He asked about shrinkage allowances in transit. He asked about payment timing, net 30, net 60, because cash flow is what kills empires, not bullets. The buyer answered with practiced ease, but his eyes kept drifting toward the shipping pens, toward the cattle moving and bawling and steaming in the rain. Even men who live in paper can feel the weight of living things. When Elias finally took the pen, the rain tapped on the roof above them like fingers. He signed Elias Dunbar, slow, steady, his hand not trembling now but heavy with age and habit. Ink pooled for a moment at the end of the last letter. The buyer blotted it with a square of paper as if it were a sacred act. A sheriff came by mid-morning, not on official business, not truly. He rode in, shook water from his hat, and accepted coffee without asking who poured it. His name was Sheriff Halverson, elected the year before in 1916, and he talked easy about keeping order and protecting property, like those were neutral words. Elias's bookkeeper later recorded a donation in the ranch ledger, $500, paid in cash, noted as community support. Community, a word that can mean whatever a powerful man needs it to mean. A judge had been at the house the week prior, dining in the parlor with boots cleaned at the door. He'd praised the ranch as a pillar of the county, and laughed softly when Elias mentioned fence-cutting in the old days, as if lawlessness was charming once you survived it. He stayed long enough to be seen, not long enough to be inconvenienced, and when he left behind the understanding that some people's problems were not going to reach the courthouse in full voice. By noon, the first rail cars were loaded. Gates clanged shut. Chains rattled. A final count was shouted and repeated and written down, car by car, head by head, until the number settled into certainty. The cattle were no longer animals then. They were weight. They were revenue. They were the ranch translated into a language the bank could read. Elias walked the edge of the pens, not stepping into the mud, just close enough to be a part of the scene. A rider named Luis, thin as wire, face cut brown by a sun, moved along the rail with a sorting stick, tapping a steer on the shoulder to turn it, calm and precise. Luis had been on the Dunbar payroll for 9 years. He had broken ribs twice, been thrown once, stitched up his own hand in a bunkhouse with needle and thread when the foreman said there wasn't time to go to town. He would never sign a government contract. But the contract existed because his hands kept the machine running. When the train finally pulled out, the engine coughing black smoke into the rain, the yard felt suddenly hollow, quiet in that particular way that follows a big movement of life. Men leaned against posts and spat and wiped their faces. Somebody laughed too loud, not because it was funny, but because the tension had to go somewhere. Elias stood watching the last car disappear, and for a moment he looked like what people wanted him to be. The great man, the builder, the one who made order out of wilderness. But the truth was, right there in the mud, in the ledger ink, in the $500 donation, in the $52 per head, in the 60,000 acres held together by debt and influence, and the labor of men who would be forgotten. And at the peak, something else always begins, quiet as the first shift in weather, a softness in the ground, a thinness in the creek. A season that doesn't behave the way it used to. So what happens when the rain that's falling today stops falling for a year, and then another? When the grass that feeds the whole machine turns brittle, when water becomes an argument again, and the big house on the hill starts to look less like a triumph and more like a target? They'll tell you the siege began with men on horses and rifles in their laps. They'll tell you it began with a threat spoken in the dark. That's how people like their violence, sudden, clean, cinematic. But most sieges start long before the first gun comes out of the scabbard. They start when the sky refuses to open. They start when the land stops giving, and you're still expected to pay like it did. It was March 27th, 1918, when Elias Dunbar stepped out onto the back porch before daylight and listened for water. Not the river. He could hear the red willow all his life, that thin talk over stones, but the sound of thaw, the drip from the eaves, the soft collapse of snowbanks, the little melt streams that usually ran down the ruts and pooled in the low spots, feeding the grass before spring even had a name. There wasn't any. The night had been clear and cold, and the ground held the cold like a grudge. The stars were still up, hard and bright, and the air had that brittle taste of iron. The porch boards creaked under his boots. Somewhere in the yard, the windmill squealed once, one long complaint, and then went quiet again, because there wasn't enough wind to spin it and not enough water to lift, even if it did. He walked down to the stock tank by the corrals with a lantern turned low. The tank was rimmed with ice, thick and dull, not the clear, glassy kind you can trust. He hit it with the butt of his glove, and it didn't give much. When he finally broke through, the water underneath was low enough that the sound of the ice cracking echoed off the metal like a drum. He held the lantern close and could see the line where water used to be, an inch, then 2, then 4 inches down from the old stain. A small drop on paper, a canyon in the body. Later that morning, the bookkeeper wrote the first dry numbers of the year. Rainfall since January, 0.9 inches. Snowpack, thin. Soil moisture, poor. Those words don't look like anything until you've watched cattle chew dirt because there's nothing else to do. Spring should have come with green. It came with wind. By May 12, 1918, dust was moving across the flats in low sheets, pale and constant, like the land was trying to leave. It got into the seams of the big house windows and made the parlor smell faintly of dry earth, no matter how much lemon oil you rubbed into the furniture. It got into the bunkhouse blankets. It got into the coffee. You'd pour a cup and see grit settle at the bottom like punishment. The riders started finding calves too weak to stand. Not dead yet. Just laid out in the sparse shade of a fence line, sides heaving, eyes dull. A man would crouch and lift the calf's head, try to get it to take water, try to get it to swallow. Sometimes it would, sometimes it wouldn't. Mercy didn't have a schedule. On June 1st, 1918, a payment went out to the bank, $250, because the ranch's obligations didn't care about weather. The check was signed in a dry room with clean hands, then carried out into a world that was turning the color of old bone. Elias watched his bookkeeper seal the envelope and felt, in a quiet place behind his ribs, the old truth returning. This was never just about land. It was about cash flow. It was always about cash flow. By July, the red willow ran so low that the stones in the bends looked like knuckles. The seep at the old bend, the one that had started it all, was still there, but it ran thin, and men began taking buckets from it as if buckets could solve a drought. The windmill turned more now, but the well it pulled from tasted like rust, algae. The cattle drank anyway. Cattle don't have pride. They have need. Hay became its own kind of currency. A ranch could survive a bad summer if it could buy feed. But everyone needed feed at the same time. On July 22, 1918, Elias sent a man to town with a wagon and cash to buy hay. The man came back with half a load and a receipt that made the foreman swear out loud. $20 a ton for prairie hay that would have been $12 in a normal year. The seller didn't apologize. There is no apology in a market. There is only price. Wages tightened, not because Elias hated his men, but because the ledger hated everybody. Riders who had been making $35 a month were told it would be $30 until things turned. The cook's pay didn't change because it never had room to change. She just worked longer, because men eat harder when they're scared. By September 9, 1918, the ranch started shipping cattle early, not because they were ready, but because keeping them alive through another month would cost more than selling them thin. They pushed 300 head toward the rail siding, each animal lighter than it should have been, hide tight, ribs hinting through. The rail agent looked them over with that bored appraisal men use when they think they're looking at numbers and not at suffering. The price came in lower than Elias had hoped, $43 per head. Not a disaster, not a triumph, a compromise with an indifferent world. The first year of drought doesn't always kill you. It teaches you. The second year is the one that collects. Winter 1918 into 1919 came with a few snows, just enough to lure hope back into the bloodstream. Men told themselves the spring would be different. They talked like talk could make it so. In March 1919, the first warm days came, and the riders saw tiny green blades push up in the bottoms. It was almost tender, the way they looked at that green, like a man looking at a baby and trying not to love it too much. Then April came dry as paper. By June 18th, 1919, the grass on the high ground had burned out early. The cattle drifted toward the river bottoms and crowded there, hooves churning the banks into mud, water turning cloudy with manure and desperation. Fights broke out in the herd, horns clacking, animals pushing and shouldering like the world had narrowed to a single drink. Men rode hard just to keep order among beasts that had no reason to trust order anymore. It was on July 4th, 1919, Independence Day, fireworks popping in town while the prairie cracked, that the foreman came to Elias with the numbers. He didn't dress it up. He didn't make a speech. Lost 112 head in the last 3 weeks, he said. And we got more going. 112. Not a story, a count. By August, the losses weren't counted in dozens. They were counted in hundreds. A rider would crest a low ridge and see carcasses in a shallow draw, bloated, split, picked at by birds, like the land itself was tallying what it was owed. The smell rode on the wind, sweet and rotten and thick enough to taste, and then came the choices that reveal who you are. Do you sell breeding stock you promised yourself you'd never touch? Do you cut deeper into wages and risk mutiny in slow motion? Do you buy hay at any price and watch the banknote swell like a bruise? Do you open your water to neighbors and hope they remember? Or do you close it and make enemies that will outlast the drought? On September 2nd, 1919, a man from downriver rode up to the Dunbar gate and asked, politely, almost humbly, if he could run his cattle to the Red Willow for a week. Just a week, he said. Got 30 head. They're hurting. Elias stood there and listened while the man talked. He could see the dust on the man's hat brim. He could see the cracks in the man's lips. He could also see behind the man the country, brown and tired and mean. He knew that if he said yes once, he would be asked again. He knew that water shared in a drought becomes water owed. He knew, too, that the ranch had always been built on the idea that what was inside the fence was protected and what was outside could fend for itself. He didn't answer right away. He looked past the man, toward the river, toward the cottonwoods that were already dropping leaves early like they were giving up. Somewhere behind him, in the big house, a clock ticked in a quiet room, measuring time as if time was still a gentle thing. He finally said, "I'll think on it." And the man rode off, not angry yet, but changed, because "I'll think on it" is what you say when you're deciding whether another man's survival is worth your risk. And out here, men remember that kind of hesitation. So when the land dries and the bank still wants its due, when hay costs 20 atlas a ton and cattle die by the hundred, when a neighbor comes asking for water and you hear your own fear answer first, who becomes your enemy then? And how often does that enemy already know your name? They'll tell you it was outsiders who came for the Dunbars, drifters, thieves, some nameless mob that blew in like dust and left the same way. That story is convenient. It lets a family keep its honor clean. It makes the threat feel foreign like weather. But the first enemies were never strangers. They were men who'd eaten Dunbar beef and slept under Dunbar roofs. They were boys who'd learned to ride in Dunbar pens. They were neighbors who knew exactly where the fences sagged and which gate latch stuck in winter. Familiar names, familiar hands, familiar grudges kept warm for years like coals under ash. It was October 14th, 1919, when the first real fracture showed itself in daylight. The day had that sharp autumn clarity that usually makes a man grateful. Sky washed clean, wind steady out of the northwest, cottonwoods along the red willow already yellowing at the edges like old paper. But the ground was still wrong. The grass on the high benches had never recovered. Cattle had chewed it down to stubble and then kept chewing. Every hoof step raised a little puff of dust. The country looked tired the way a face looks tired when it's been sick too long. Elias Dunbar rode into town that morning in a wagon, not on a horse. That told you something. A wagon meant he meant business, meant paper, meant he was carrying something heavier than a rifle. In the bed was a stack of folded notices, legal-sized sheets with a formal header, the kind of language that never sweats and never starves. His bookkeeper had drafted them the night before, copying the same paragraph over and over until the ink went dull on the nib. Notice of trespass. That was the first line that mattered. Inside the county office, Harlan Mott was gone by then, retired or dead, depending on who you asked. But the new clerk had the same ink-stained fingers and the same quiet appetite for fees. He stamped the notices and took his money without looking him in the eye. $3.50 in filing and service charges, neat as a church tithe. Elias watched the stamp come down, thunk, and felt the old memory of 1883, how a life gets changed by the sound of metal on paper. By noon, those notices were being carried out by deputies. Sheriff Halverson had 3 men wearing stars that day: Deputy Rusk, Deputy Miller, and Deputy Ames, and each one of them had a Dunbar story. Rusk had once ridden for Elias in 1908, young and eager, until he broke his collarbone in a fall and realized the ranch didn't have room for broken men. Miller's brother had been hired and fired in the same season when wages tightened. Ames owed the bank and hated everyone who didn't. They rode out in a line, dust curling behind them, and they served papers to the very people Elias had once nodded to at church. Men with small outfits, 160 acres here, 320 there, men who'd been running a few head along the Red Willow for years because the river didn't belong to anyone in their minds. They stood in their yards, hats in hands, reading words they didn't like, and you could see it happen in their faces, the moment resentment finds a legal shape. One of those papers went to a man named Calvin Greer downriver, the same man who'd asked for a week of water on September 2nd. Greer was 42, with a sunburned neck and hands that looked older than his face. He had 30 head left by then. 30, not because he'd never had more, but because drought and hay prices and bad luck had done their work. When Deputy Rusk handed him the notice, Greer didn't argue. He just read it twice. Slowly, lips moving. Then he looked up and said, "Quiet. So that's how it is." Rusk shrugged like it wasn't his doing. "It's how it is," he said back. That line traveled. It traveled in town that evening, carried from counter to counter in the general store where men bought coffee and tried not to look desperate. It traveled in the back room of the saloon where the stove was too hot and the whiskey was too cheap, and the talk was the kind that starts as complaint and ends as plan. It traveled to the Grange Hall on the edge of town, a plain wooden building that smelled of old pine boards and spilled kerosene, where men met on Tuesdays to argue about roads and taxes and, lately, survival. On October 21st, 1919, they gathered there, 17 men by the count of the schoolteacher's husband, who wrote names down in a notebook because he believed in records. 17 men and 2 women who didn't speak much, but listened the way women listen when they know the consequences will land on their kitchens too. They sat on folding chairs and benches and stood along the walls. Hats stayed on. Hands stayed visible. Calvin Greer was there. So was Silas Klein's eldest boy, no longer a boy, now 35, jaw set hard, the same eyes his father had used when he watched the red willow like it was a promise being stolen. Tom Oates was there too, old and thin, coughing into a handkerchief that was more gray than white. Oates had built the Dunbar fences. Oates had watched the house rise plank by plank. Oates had slept in the bunkhouse and bled into the work, and then watched wages get cut like they were trimming fat. He didn't say much at first. He didn't need to. Everyone knew why he was there, because he knew the ranch from the inside, and inside knowledge is its own kind of gun. A man from the rail siding spoke for a while, Eddie Lark, a loading hand who'd done time in Omaha and come back with ideas that sounded dangerous in ranch country. He talked about organization. He didn't use the word union too loud, but he didn't hide it either. He mentioned the year 1919 like it was proof. Strikes in cities, soldiers home from France with nowhere to go, prices climbing and then dropping. He said men were tired of being handled like cattle. Some in the room shifted uncomfortably because ranchers don't like being compared to anything they own. But they listened anyway, because hunger makes room for new languages. Then Oates finally spoke. He coughed once, wiped his mouth, and said, "You all keep thinking this is about water." He let that sit. "It ain't just water," he said. "It's about who gets to say no." He looked around the room, eyes bright with fever or anger, hard to tell. The Dunbars got papers. They got the sheriff. They got the bank. And if you think this ends with you keeping your little trickle of river, you ain't been paying attention. He told them things, not secrets, not movie plot revelations. Worse than that, practical truths, where the back fences were weak. Which gate chain could be slipped without making noise? Which stock tank went low first? How the Dunbar riders rotated night checks, 2 men on Tuesdays and Fridays, 1 man on the other nights. Because the payroll had tightened, he named the hours. He named the habits. He spoke like a man reciting scripture, and every detail made the ranch feel less like a fortress and more like a body with veins you could cut. The room went quiet when he was done. Someone asked, "What are you saying we do?" And that was the moment the air changed, because planning violence is different from talking about unfairness. Unfairness is safe. Violence is commitment. Oates didn't answer directly. He just said, "We don't need to win. We just need them to feel it." Outside the hall, the night had gone cold. Stars hard as nails. Wind dragging dry leaves along the ground like a whisper. Men stepped out one by one, lighting cigarettes with cupped hands, the match flare brief and nervous. They didn't leave together. They didn't shake hands. They didn't want to look like a mob. They wanted to look like nothing at all. Across town, in the Dunbar parlor, Elias sat with his ledger open and read a letter from Clarence Vale's bank, dated October 20th, 1919, reminding him of obligations and risk exposure and the importance of maintaining control of assets. It was polite. It was threatening. Elias folded it and stared at the lamp flame until his eyes watered. He could feel the ranch tightening around him, drought outside, dead inside, neighbors hardening into something else, He'd always believed he could outlast weather and outmaneuver men. He'd built fences and bought land and paid sheriffs and signed papers and called it order. But order is only order as long as everyone agrees it is. So when the people who know your gates and your schedules and your weak corners stop seeing you as a neighbor and start seeing you as a fortress full of water, what happens next? And when those familiar names finally decide that paper isn't going to feed their children, how long before they trade talk for rifles and turn resentment into a siege? They say it was a righteous standoff. Good men inside, bad men outside. They say the Dunbars were besieged by outlaws and malcontents, and the law arrived like dawn and made things right again. It's a story folks can live with. It keeps the lines straight, but the truth is the lines were never straight. The truth is the siege was a business meeting with rifles. It was hunger wearing a moral mask. It was men who knew one another's children, now squinting down iron sights because paper had stopped working. It happened on January 16th, 1920, on a night so cold the air felt sharpened, the kind of cold that makes wood pop and groan like it's alive. Snow lay on the ground in a hard crust, not deep, just enough to swallow tracks and make the prairie look innocent. The wind came in low from the north, steady, carrying the smell of sage crushed under hooves, and the faint stink of coal smoke from the Dunbar house where the stove had been fed since noon. Inside that house were 11 people. Elias Dunbar, 63 and breathing like a man pulling air through cloth. His wife, 2 sons, both grown, both tense, both trying to look like men who weren't afraid. A daughter who kept her hands busy because idle hands shake. 2 hired hands who'd refused to leave when the trouble started. Not out of loyalty exactly, but because the world outside the fence felt worse than the world inside it. And 3 others, an old woman upstairs who couldn't walk, and 2 children who had been told, firmly and gently, that it was a game and they must stay quiet. They had 2 crates of ammunition under the kitchen table, pine boxes stained with oil, nails half bent from being pried open and closed again. They'd counted it by lamplight. 640 rounds of .30-30, 120 shotgun shells, and a smaller tin of revolver cartridges that felt almost ceremonial, like relics from a different era. They had 4 long guns worth trusting, and 2 that jammed if you breathed wrong. They had 1 well that was down to mud and ice, and a kitchen pot already blackened from melting snow. Outside were 27 riders, some on horses, some on mules, a couple leading extra mounts like they expected this to take time. 27 isn't a number that happens by accident. It's a number that gets agreed upon in a back room. A number that says, we brought enough to matter. They took positions in a wide crescent, far enough apart that darkness lived between them like another set of men. Some had Winchesters across their saddle horns. Some had shotguns. One carried a long-barreled rifle wrapped in canvas, careful as a man carrying a newborn. A few had scarves pulled up over their mouths, not to hide their faces from the Dunbars, everyone already knew everyone, but to hide their faces from themselves. At 8:40 p.m., the first sound came, hooves on crusted snow, slow and deliberate, then the faint jingle of tack, then a cough, quickly smothered, then the silence again, thick as wool. Inside, the big house held its breath. The lantern in the kitchen window burned low behind smoky glass, and the shadows in the corners looked too tall. Elias sat with his back to the wall, not for bravery, but because his lungs wouldn't let him stand long. His eldest son, Frank, checked the rifle action for the 5th time. the metal clicking soft. His jaw clenched so hard you could see the muscle working. At 8:52 p.m., someone outside fired one shot. Not at the house. Not yet. Into the air. A crack that snapped the night open and then left it ringing. A statement. A reminder. The children upstairs whimpered and were shushed so fast it sounded like a slap. At 9:03 p.m., a voice called out from the dark. Not screaming, not pleading, just loud enough to carry. "Dunbar, come out and talk." It was Calvin Greer. Elias knew the voice the way you know the sound of your own windmill. Greer had hauled water at Dunbar's during a hard summer years back. Greer had once laughed on Dunbar's porch at a joke he didn't fully trust. Now he stood out there with a rifle in his hands, asking for talk the way men ask for mercy they don't intend to grant. Frank leaned close to Elias. "We answer." Elias swallowed, the movement painful. He looked toward the window, where the lantern shook slightly from a draft. His other son, Will, stood near the back door with a shotgun held like a tool, not like a symbol. Was it negotiation, or was it a trap dressed up as civility? Elias nodded once. Frank stepped to the door, kept behind the frame, and called back, "What do you want?" Greer's answer came steady. "Water and the papers. And we want you to stop choking the river like it belongs to you alone." There it was. Not romance, not ideology. A demand list. A hired hand inside. Luis, the same thin rider who'd sorted cattle in the rain years before, muttered, "They ain't here to talk?" Frank snapped, "Quiet!" At 9:15 p.m., a figure moved forward from the line, hands raised. Not Greer. Tom Oates. Oates's cough carried before his boots did. He stepped into the lantern's reach just enough to be seen, his hat in one hand, the other hand held open to show it was empty. He looked older than he should have. His face was hollow, eyes bright, with something that might have been fever or conviction. "I ain't here to fight you," Oates called, voice rough. "I'm here to end this before somebody's boy dies in the snow." Frank leaned toward the window, careful. "Go home." "Tom." Oates shook his head. "Can't. Not now." He stood there in the cold, breath pluming, and delivered the message like a man reading a court order. Greer and the others wanted the Dunbars to sign over access rights, written, witnessed, so the Red Willow couldn't be closed again. They wanted the trespass notices rescinded. They wanted the sheriff kept out of it. And they wanted it tonight. Because the longer you let a crowd stand with guns, the more it becomes a different kind of creature. Elias listened and felt the edges of the room narrow. In the corner, his wife was silently laying out bandages and a basin as if preparing for childbirth. The daughter kept refilling a kettle with snow, hands red from cold, eyes fixed on nothing. Elias asked, "And if we refuse?" Oates paused. That pause told the truth better than any threat. "They'll take what they can," Oates said. "Cattle, hay, guns, whatever's there. And if somebody shoots first, it won't stop." At 9:27 p.m., a second shot cracked, closer this time. The bullet hit the porch post with a sound like a hammer strike, throwing a splinter into the dark. The house flinched as if it could feel pain. Will swore under his breath. Luis raised his rifle. Frank hissed, "No, don't!" Elias's breathing turned wet. He pressed a hand to his chest, not dramatic, just practical, like he was trying to hold something in its place. His wife saw it and went to him, but he waved her off with a small, stubborn motion. Pride is a strange thing. It survives even when lungs don't. At 9:33 p.m., Frank shouted, "That's your warning. Next one comes in, we shoot back." Greer's voice came hard now. "You already been shooting at folks for years with paper, Dunbar. Tonight we're just speaking a language you understand." A minute later, Oates stepped back into the dark. The lantern light left his face and swallowed him. The cold deepened, the wind rose, horses shifted. Somewhere a man spat, and it sounded loud. At 9:46 p.m., the first volley came. 3 shots in quick sequence. One punched through the kitchen window, shattering glass inward. The lantern guttered as a draft rushed in. A child screamed upstairs. Frank fired once in return, the rifle report deafening inside the walls, and the bullet went out into darkness and hit nothing anyone would later admit to. The siege had become what it came to be. From then on, it wasn't cinematic. It was hours of waiting and flinching, of listening to hooves crunch and then stop, of counting rounds, of trying to keep children quiet while the night pressed in like a hand on the throat, of a patriarch's breath growing shorter between the shots, each inhale sounding like it might be the last. Near midnight, 11:58 p.m. by the mantel clock, Elias tried to stand and couldn't. His knees buckled and Frank caught him, and for a second the great man looked like what he really was, just a body, just time catching up. His wife leaned close and whispered, "Elias." He opened his mouth as if to answer, and then only air came out, thin and useless. Outside, the men held their line. Inside, the family held theirs. Between them was cold and debt and drought and the stubborn American belief that if you hold long enough, the world will call you right. But what happens when morning comes and you're still alive, still surrounded, still owing, still hated, and the only way out is to sign something away and call it anything but surrender? They'll tell you the Dunbars never surrendered, that the old man died like a storybook patriarch, rifle in hand, jaw set, refusing the world right up to the last breath. Folks like that kind of death because it feels earned, clean, noble. But surrender almost never announces itself as surrender. It calls itself a settlement. It calls itself a restructuring. It calls itself what had to be done. And Elias Dunbar, who had spent his whole life turning land into paper and paper back into land, didn't meet his end with a gunshot. He met it the way most empires do, in a room that smelled like coal smoke and ink. The morning after the shooting, January 17th, 1920, came gray and flat, the kind of winter dawn that looks like it was poured into the sky. The snow on the yard had a crust on it, and the crust held the hoof prints from the night before like fossils. The riders were still out there, spread wide, quieter now, their horses' backs rimmed with frost. Men don't cheer at sunrise after a night like that. They just endure the light. Inside the house, the kitchen window was a ragged hole stuffed with a blanket. Glass lay on the floor like spilled ice. The lantern had been moved off the sill and set on the table beside the ammunition crates, and the light it threw was weak and yellow, like it was ashamed to be there. Elias sat in the same place he'd sat through the night, back to the wall, head slightly forward, hands in his lap. His breathing had changed. It wasn't just short. It was wet. Every inhale made a sound like water being pulled through reeds. His wife had wrapped a shawl around his shoulders and kept one hand on his forearm as if touch could keep a man from leaving. Frank stood behind him, eyes red, unshaven, rifle still close. Will kept walking from window to window, like motion alone could hold the walls up. At 7:10 a.m., Sheriff Halverson arrived, not alone. 2 deputies with him, one carrying a white flour sack tied to a stick like a flag. The sheriff didn't ride into the crescent like a hero. He rode into it like a man trying not to get killed by people he'd campaigned with. He called out for Calvin Greer first, not the Dunbars. That told you where the center of gravity had shifted. Greer stepped forward from the line and met him halfway, boots crunching on crusted snow, rifle slung, but not gone. They spoke low for a while, heads close, breath clouding between them. The sheriff glanced up at the house once, like a man looking at a storm cellar and deciding whether it's safe. Then Halverson walked to the Dunbar porch with the flour sack flag held out ahead of him, careful, palms open. Frank didn't open the door wide. He cracked it just enough to speak through. "What you want?" he said. Halverson's voice was steady. "I want this stopped." "Then arrest him." Halverson looked past Frank into the room, to the shattered window, the blanket, the crates, the children's faces peeking from the stairwell like frightened animals. His eyes flicked to Elias and back away again, as if looking too long would be disrespectful. "You know I can't arrest half the county," Halverson said. "Not today." That was the first honest sentence spoken on that porch. The negotiation that followed wasn't noble. It was inventory. What could be traded to buy time? What words could be written that would let men put their rifles down without admitting they'd lost? By 9:30 a.m., a temporary agreement was scratched out on the kitchen table. The sheriff brought a county attorney named George Sutter. Thin man, clean cuffs, hair oiled down neat, who kept wiping his pen nib as if ranch air offended it. Sutter wrote in careful language while everyone watched his hand move. The Dunbars would rescind the trespass notices for 30 days. A stockwater corridor would be recognized along the Red Willow, 30 feet from the ordinary high water mark, so neighbors could bring cattle to drink without crossing fences deeper into Dunbar ground. In return, Greer and the others would pull back from the house, return any livestock taken, and submit their grievances through lawful channels, spoken in a room with bullet holes. At 10:12 a.m., Frank signed first, Will signed second. Elias tried to lift his hand to take the pen and couldn't. His fingers didn't want to close. His wife steadied his wrist, and he made a mark that looked more like a stumble than a signature. Sutter blotted it quickly, almost tenderly, like he was saving the moment for the record. By noon, the riders drifted away, not as a victory parade, but as a slow, wary unraveling. They took their horses, their rifles, their grudges. The siege ended the way drought ends sometimes, by exhausting everyone into temporary peace. Elias didn't make it through the day. At 3:40 p.m., with the stove ticking and the house quiet for the first time in a long time, his breathing simply thinned out and stopped. Not dramatic, not a final speech. His wife said his name once, soft, as if not to wake him, and then put her hand on his cheek and felt the cooling start. Frank stood there, holding the dead weight of the story he'd inherited. Will went outside and vomited in the snow behind the woodpile where nobody could see him. And then the second siege began, the one no rifle can answer. On February 2nd, 1920, the Dunbar family sat in Clarence Vale's bank under a ceiling stained by years of coal heat. The same brass spittoon, the same hard chairs, the same ink smell. But Elias was no longer there to glare and bargain and pretend he could outlast the paper world. Now It was his widow in black, Frank with his hands clenched on his knees and Will staring at the floor like it might open. Vail had new documents on his desk, thicker than the ceasefire agreement, heavier in consequence. Probate, appraisal, and a notice about federal estate taxes under the Revenue Act of 1918. Cold language that didn't care about drought or siege or the fact that a man had just died trying to hold on to water. The government wanted its share. The bank wanted its payments. The county wanted its taxes. Grief doesn't pause any of that. It just sits beside it. The appraisal number sat there like a verdict. $120,000 estimated value for land, improvements, and cattle, based on market conditions. Market conditions. As if the market had been there in the kitchen when bullets came through the window. The tax due, after exemptions and arguments and the lawyer's careful arithmetic, came to $38,400, payable on a schedule the government called reasonable. Reasonable to whom? A ranch might be worth $1 million and still not have $38,000 in cash without selling something living. Vail didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He slid another paper forward, a restructure proposal. The ranch would retain the core, 22,000 acres along the Red Willow, the big house, the main corrals, the best bottomland. The rest, 38,000 acres of outer pasture and marginal bench, would be sold off immediately to satisfy tax, calm the bank, and put a fence around the family's remaining future. The buyer was already waiting in the hallway. Benton Land Syndicate, out of the state capital, represented by a man named Harold Priest, who wore gloves indoors like he was afraid of ranch dirt. The price was written plain, $10.50 per acre for 38,000 acres, a number that would have sounded like salvation in a bad year and sounded like theft when you remembered the ranch had once been spoken of at $18 an acre in better times. Priest didn't talk about community. He didn't talk about legacy. He talked about acreage blocks and future development potential. He talked like the land was already dead and only its uses remained. Frank argued once, one sharp sentence about robbery and blood and the fact that his father had built this with his hands. Vail let him finish, and then looked at the ledger. He pointed calmly to dates and sums and penalties. He pointed to the June 1st payment. He pointed to interest. He pointed to the new legal exposure after the siege, attorney fees, sheriff costs, and the quiet risk that the county might decide the Dunbars were more trouble than they were worth. The lawyer's fee alone was $600 up front, another $25 per hour after that. The sheriff had submitted extraordinary service costs totaling $312 for $40. Small numbers compared to the ranch. Big numbers when cash was tight and the world was watching. In the end, the family signed, not because they wanted to, because the alternative was a foreclosure notice nailed to a door and the Dunbar name auctioned off in the same courthouse where it had once been born. On March 4th, 1920, the deed transfer was recorded. Stamp, ink, the same old sound. The ranch didn't die that day. It shrank, it tightened its belt, it survived by shedding skin. Outside the bank, the wind moved down the street, carrying dust and horse smell and the faint sweetness of coal smoke. Frank stood on the boardwalk and watched Benton's man step into a buggy like he'd just bought a new coat. Will stared at the bank window where their reflection floated, two sons trying to look like inheritors instead of survivors. They rode back to the ranch with papers that said they'd stabilized. They rode back past fences that now marked not just boundaries, but loss. Posts that used to mean protection, now meaning subtraction. And beneath it all, under the grass in the dry draws and the bench land Benton had just bought cheap, the earth sat quiet, holding its own secrets like it always had. So what happens when the next kind of wealth isn't standing on four legs, but sleeping underground in black silence, waiting for someone with a drill to wake it? They say the Dunbars were saved by grit again, that after the siege and the shrinkage and the humiliation of selling off 38,000 acres, they went back to the old religion, cattle, fences, dawn rides, and clawed their way upright the way a man stands up after a beating, spitting blood and smiling anyway. But the truth is, the ranch didn't come back on horseback. It came back on paper. It came back in a quiet clause that most folks didn't notice when the Benton Land Syndicate deed was recorded on March 4th, 1920. One line, tucked in among the legal throat clearing, that said the Dunbars reserved the minerals, oil, gas, other substances of value. A sentence that looked like nothing, a sentence that turned out to be the only thing that mattered. In 1921, the country was trying to remember what peace felt like. Men came home from Europe with their eyes changed. Prices snapped and wobbled like a nervous horse. In town, new automobiles started showing up, dusty Fords with engines that sounded like angry sewing machines, while the old wagons still creaked along beside them as if time had split into two lanes and nobody could decide which to take. Out on the Dunbar place, what was left of it, the core 22,000 acres along the Red Willow, Frank Dunbar ran the days like a man keeping a lid on boiling water. He rode less than his father had, but he watched more. He watched the river. He watched neighbors. He watched the ledger, because cattle were still cattle and drought was still drought, and the bank still wanted its due, whether the grass was thick or not. Then on May 18th, 1922, a stranger rode in, not on a horse, but in a car, a black Model T, with a windshield filmed in dust and a spare tire strapped to the side like a life preserver. The man who stepped out wore boots that were too clean and a hat that had never been sweated through. He carried a leather case and a smile that worked like a tool. His name was Harold Preece, same man as before, Benton's man, or a cousin of his kind, one of those land agents who seemed to share a single face. In the oil country, they called them landmen, men who never drill, never haul, never sweat in the sun the way roughnecks do, men who trade in the invisible. Frank met him on the porch. The big house still stood, but it had the look of something surviving rather than flourishing. Paint flaked at the corners. A window pane in the back had been replaced with a slightly wrong piece of glass that caught the light strange. The porch boards creaked like tired joints. Preece didn't ask about the siege. He didn't ask about Elias. He asked about minerals. He opened his leather case and took out maps. Real maps, printed clean, with section lines and little symbols that looked like nothing to anyone who'd spent their life reading grass. He pointed to a swath of land west of the Red Willow. Not even on the 22,000 acres Frank still controlled above ground, but on parcels that had been sold off. Benton land now, where the Dunbars still held what lay beneath, because of that clause in the deed. "You retain the mineral estate," Preece said, like he was congratulating Frank on a clever joke. Frank didn't smile. He said, "We retained what?" Preece didn't seem offended. He'd explained this to men before. He told Frank about the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920, how the federal government had changed the way certain minerals were handled on public lands, how the country was learning to treat what was underground as a national appetite. He told him about nearby Wildcat Wells. He told him about a new outfit, Red Willow Petroleum Company, looking to lease mineral rights across a wide block. Frank listened with his eyes narrowed because ranchers understand cattle the way bankers understand interest, and everything else sounds like a scam until proven otherwise. "What's the offer?" Frank asked. Priest slid a paper across the porch table, a lease, thick enough to feel serious. It offered a bonus, 100 res per acre, paid upon signing. It offered a royalty, 1/8 of production, 12.5%, the old standard that had become almost biblical in oil deals. And it offered a term, 5 years, with extensions if production was found. The acres in question totaled 8,740, parts of old Dunbar bench land now in Benton's hands, but still tethered to the Dunbar name by the dark geography beneath. Frank stared at that number. 8,640 acres. He did the math the way he'd been forced to do since his father died. 8,140 acres at $1 per acre meant $8,140 cash. Soon, not promised, not dependent on rain, cash that didn't require feeding, doctoring, fencing, or shipping, cash that didn't bawl or die or get stolen in the night. He felt sick at how good it sounded. Priest watched him feel it. That was his job, watching men realize they're about to become complicit in something. Frank asked, "And if there's oil?" Priest shrugged like oil was weather. "Then you get your eighth." Frank asked about damages, roads cut through pasture, tanks, spills, cattle spooked by noise. Priest said there would be a surface use agreement. "Standard," he said, another word that means we've made this ordinary by doing it 1,000 times. Frank didn't sign that day. He told Priest he'd talk to his brother. He told him he'd talk to the lawyer in town. The same George Sutter who'd written ceasefire language while bullets were still warm in wood. Priest nodded, calm, as if time belonged to him. 2 weeks later, June 2nd, 1922, Frank sat in Sutter's office with the lease spread open. The office smelled of paper and pipe smoke and the faint sourness of old coffee. Sutter adjusted his spectacles and read clauses out loud, pausing at words like indemnify and assign and pooling as if he were tasting them. Frank asked the only question that mattered. "Is this real?" Sutter said, "It's real the way debt is real." Then he pointed to the royalty clause again, 1/8, 12.5%. He pointed to the bonus again, $8,640. He pointed to the fact that the Dunbars had been paying lawyers and banks and taxes since Elias died, and that cattle prices were not a promise you could build a future on the way they used to be. Frank signed on June 6, 1922, with Sutter as witness, a fountain pen this time, borrowed from the lawyer's desk. Smooth ink, no scratch, no struggle. The signature looked almost elegant, which should have been a warning. The check arrived 5 days later, June 11th, drawn on a bank in the state capitol. Frank held it in his hand and felt the weirdness of money that came without sweat. It was like being handed a bucket of water when you hadn't dug the well. He took it to Clarence Vale's bank and watched the teller's eyebrows rise just slightly when the amount was read aloud. Vale himself came out from the back office, smiling that banker's smile, and said, "That'll help." It did. It paid down arrears. It bought feed. It bought time. Time is what men always think they can purchase and what they almost never spend wisely. The drilling started in the spring of 1923, not with a grand announcement. With trucks and men and noise, they cut a road across land that used to be quiet enough to hear a hawk's wings. They set up a rig, wood and steel and cables, taller than any cottonwood in sight. At night, lights burned out there like a small city, and the prairie looked wrong under that harsh white glow. On April 19th, 1923, the first test came back promising. That was the word the oil men used. Promising meant the smell of crude on the wind. Promising meant men in coveralls laughing too loud. Promising meant Frank lying awake in the big house, listening to the distant clank and whine and thinking about his father who'd died fighting for water while the real fortune had been sleeping under his feet the whole time. Then, on September 7th, 1923, the first royalty check arrived. Not a miracle number, not yet. One out $876.40, itemized, cold, with deductions Frank didn't understand, and Sutter would have to explain. But it was money that didn't require shipping cattle in the rain, money that came out of the ground like a confession. The second check was larger than the third. Then it became a rhythm, monthly, steady, like a new kind of rainfall that only blessed those who owned the right pieces of paper. And here's the part nobody says out loud. Oil didn't just change the Dunbars' finances, it changed their morality. Because cattle money is earned in public, people see the herds, they see the work, they see the losses. Oil money arrives in envelopes, quiet, clean, and a clean kind of wealth makes a man start believing he deserves it. Frank began repairing the house. New shingles, new paint, a new stove ordered by rail that cost $112 and arrived smelling of machine oil and promise. He hired back hands he'd let go. He bought hay without flinching at the price. He started talking about diversifying like a town man because once you taste money that doesn't sweat, you start wanting more of it. But oil has a way of making enemies, too. Not because it dries up grass, because it makes you look lucky. And in ranch country, luck is just theft that nobody can prove. So what happens when the Dunbars are no longer just ranchers with a wounded name, but royalty again? Only this time their crown is underground, and their wealth arrives in quiet checks. How do you explain that to a county that still remembers the siege? And how do you sell a story clean enough that nobody notices the blood in the ink? They say a place like Dunbar survives because the family remembers. Because the old stories get told at the table, and the young ones grow up with the names of rivers and men and mistakes laid into them like fence staples. They say legacy is a thing you keep in your blood. But the truth is, legacy is a product. It's packaging. It's what you do when the cattle don't pay like they used to, and the oil checks don't feel permanent, and the county starts paving roads past your gate like the world intends to come in whether you invite it or not. On August 2nd, 1978, the morning came bright and thin, the kind of late summer light that makes everything look honest, even when it isn't. The red willow was low but running. Cottonwoods rattled in a dry breeze, and out by the main gate, new steel now, not the old chain and post, there was a freshly painted sign hung straight as a promise. Dunbar Ranch, Heritage, and Hunting Esty. 1883, Ray Dunbar stood there with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand and watched two men wrestle the sign's bolts tight. Ray was Frank's boy, born in 1924, old enough to remember the last years when the ranch still felt like a ranch and not a business plan. He wore good boots, but he still carried himself like a man who'd been thrown off a horse in his life. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His jaw looked like it had been set against something for decades. Behind him, the big house sat in the sun, freshly painted a pale color that tried to look timeless. The porch rail had been replaced the year before, after rot got into it. The windows were new glass and old frames, because tourists like the look of age but don't like the draft. Inside, the parlor smelled of lemon oil and old pine and a faint trace of cigar smoke that no amount of cleaning ever quite got rid of. The place still held the echo of the siege, if you believed in echoes, or maybe it held the echo of money-changing hands. At 9:15 a.m., a sedan came up the drive, tan, late model, clean. It rolled over the cattle guard and didn't even slow, as if it trusted the ranch to behave itself. The man who stepped out wore a short-sleeved dress shirt and a tie that looked like it had never been loosened. He carried a briefcase and a clipboard. He introduced himself like he was presenting a product. Martin Hale, Bozeman Marketing Group. He didn't ask about the creek. He didn't ask about cattle. He didn't ask about drought years or lost men or the way the wind can turn mean in an hour. He asked about capacity. "How many guests can you sleep comfortably?" he said, pen poised. Ray didn't like the word comfortably. Comfort was what got men killed, his father used to say. But Ray answered anyway. 24 beds, he said. If you count the bunkhouse remodel, 12 if you're talking just the main house. Hale nodded, writing it down like it was inventory on a shelf. He asked about meals. Ray said the kitchen could feed 30 if the cook had help and the stove didn't act up. Hale asked about access. Ray pointed to the county road out front, newly improved, and said the state had widened it 2 years back. Hale smiled, as if the road was a gift. The road wasn't a gift. The road was pressure. The road was the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 made real and local decades later, turning distance into a smaller thing, turning privacy into a rumor. Every year, it got easier for people to show up. And once people can show up, they eventually do. They walked the property in slow steps, Hale taking notes, Ray pointing with his coffee cup. The ranch still held 22,000 acres on paper, core ground, bottom land, and a wide belt of pasture that had survived the old sell-off. The mineral rights still threw money off in good years, but oil had started acting fickle, and Ray had learned not to trust any resource that comes out of a hole in the ground. He'd watched boom talk turn into silence before. Hale stopped at the old north fence line where the siege had pressed close in 1920. Someone, Ray's mother, years earlier, had kept the porch post with the bullet scar after it was replaced, and now it stood in the barn like a relic. Hale wanted it moved. "Display it," he said. "People love authenticity." Ray stared at him. "That's where a man almost died," he said. Hale didn't blink. "All the more reason," he said. "That's a story." And that was the moment Ray understood what he was doing. Not preserving. Selling. They sat at the kitchen table at 11:40 a.m. with the contract spread out between them. The same table where ceasefire language had been scratched out in January 1920. The same table that had held ammunition crates. Now it held a marketing agreement with clean type and clean margins. Hale's proposal was precise. A brochure run of 10,000 copies. Full color, heavy stock. A logo redesign. A heritage narrative for tours. An annual siege weekend event with guided walks and staged storytelling. No firearms. Family-friendly. A new sign at the county road. A reservation phone line. Total fee, $18 to $500 for the first year, paid in 3 installments. Hale pointed to the numbers with his pen like he was laying out feed rations. Ray's wife, Diane, stood at the sink pretending to wash a cup that was already clean. She listened without looking. 2 hired hands came in with dust on their jeans and paused when they saw the suit at the table. Hale smiled at them like they were part of the scenery. Ray asked about control. "What gets said?" he said. "Who says it?" Hale gave him a practiced answer. "You're the steward," he said. "We just help folks understand." Ray could taste the lie in that sentence the way you can taste alkali and bad water, but he also could taste something else: inevitability. The ranch needed new money. Cattle margins were thin. Repairs weren't getting cheaper. Property taxes didn't care about nostalgia. And a place that had once been defended with rifles was now being defended with receipts. Ray signed at 12:06 p.m. The pen was smooth, a ballpoint, no scratch, no ink bottle smell. The signature looked easy. That should have bothered him more than it did. By late afternoon, the first changes were already happening. A young woman from town arrived to interview Diane about family recipes for the brochure. Another man came to measure the parlor for a display case. A phone installer showed up with a spool of wire and a plastic handset, and he drilled into old wood without flinching. The ranch hands watched from the yard, expressions flat. The people who would actually make this new Dunbar machine run weren't in that contract. They weren't in Hale's clean language. They were in the kitchen and the bunkhouse and the laundry room. Rosa's granddaughter, now the cook, was paid $2.65 an hour, the federal minimum wage that year, and she worked past dark because tourists want breakfast early and dinner late and coffee always. A young wrangler named Miguel, 22, quiet, fast on a horse, made $180 a week in season and slept in a room that still smelled faintly of saddle soap and old sweat no matter how often the sheets were washed. A housekeeper from town drove out every morning, scrubbed toilets, changed linens, smiled at guests, and drove home with her hands smelling of bleach. These were the bodies that held the heritage experience together, while the Dunbar name sat on top like a label. That evening, after Hale left, Ray walked alone into the barn and stood in front of the old porch post with the bullet scar. He ran his fingers over the splintered wound. The wood was smooth now where years of handling had worn it down. He could imagine the shot. He could imagine the sound inside the house. He could imagine his grandfather's wet breathing. And now he could imagine a family from the city standing right there in the clean sneakers while a guide told the story with careful pauses, ending with a joke to keep it light. Was this an act of preservation? Or was it the final kind of conquest, taking the ugliest parts of your history and selling them back as entertainment? Outside, the red willow kept running the way it always had, indifferent to brochures. A wind moved through the cottonwoods, and for a second the ranch felt like it used to, quiet, heavy, private. Then a car came up the drive slow, tires crunching, and headlights washed across the yard like searchlights. And Ray remembered the old truth. Once the world learns you're profitable, it never stops coming. So, what does it say about a country, about us, that a siege becomes a weekend package, that blood becomes a brand, that the land gets sold and resold in prettier language, and we call it heritage with a straight face? They say history is a line a straight road you can follow from one clean event to the next. If you keep your eyes open and your heart steady, they say you can stand in the present and look back and see causes lined up like fence posts. This happened, then that happened. The myth of inevitability, the myth of order. But history isn't a line. It's a weather pattern. It circles, it returns, it changes its coat, and keeps the same teeth. If you drive out to where the Dunbar gate sits now, steel and chain, painted fresh every few years because fresh paint is cheaper than new truth, you can still find nights when the wind comes low out of the north and carries that clean metallic bite. You can still find nights when snow lies down hard and squeaks under a boot, not soft, not pretty, but sharp and dry like crushed glass. You can still find a kitchen window lit from within, light trembling behind glass, and you can smell coffee boiled twice, and tallow and damp wool, and the faint sour of old smoke baked into wood. And if you stand there long enough, and you let yourself be quiet enough, you can almost hear it again, the way a horse stamps in the dark, the small sound that carries like confession. You can almost see that crescent of riders out beyond the yard, spaced far apart, darkness living between them like another kind of man. 27. Or 26 or 30. The number changes depending on who tells it, because numbers are honest, but memory isn't. Now the riders come in different shapes. They come in SUVs and rental cars with out-of-state plates. They come with coolers and cameras and clean boots that have never found a gopher hole at a run. They pull up slow, as if they're approaching sacred ground, and in a way they are. Sacred not because it's pure, sacred because it was paid for, over and over again, by someone else's hunger. They park where the old corral used to be and walk up to the big house, and someone hands them a brochure heavy as a promise. The brochure says, Est, 1883, in a proud font. It says heritage. It says authentic. It tells them about the siege, softened at the edges, packaged like a campfire story. It might even show them a scarred porch post in a display case, a relic with a small plaque that doesn't mention the smell of blood or the sound a bullet makes when it enters dry wood. They take a guided walk, and they hear names, Elias, Frank, Ray, names that survive because they were printed and repeated and defended. They hear about grit. They hear about courage. They hear about the spirit of the West. And maybe, if the guide is honest enough or tired enough, they also hear about debt, about drought, about how water turns neighbors into wolves, about how law is a coat men put on violence when they want to call it respectable. But even that honesty has a price, because the story still has to sell. The visitor still has to leave feeling like they touched something real without getting cut. And meanwhile, behind the house and away from the brochure's frame, the work is still happening. Sheets still get washed, toilets still get scrubbed, meals still get cooked before dawn. Someone still repairs fences in wind that can flay your face raw. Someone still rides out when a calf goes missing. The workforce is different now, seasonal, hourly, commuting, yet the old truth remains. Empires always pretend they were built by one name, when they were built by many hands. And the land itself, what does it remember? The red willow still runs when it runs. It still goes low when it goes low. It still tastes of iron some years and sweet other years. The cottonwoods still rattle their leaves like old paper. The windmill still squeals when the wind hits it just right, a thin complaint that sounds almost human if you listen too hard. Under the ground, The old mineral seams still sit in their black silence, and somewhere a pump jack might still be nodding slow, like a tired animal, pulling wealth up in measured strokes while people above argue about heritage and deserve. This is the American epic, if you want it plain. Not the cowboy singing under stars, not the noble patriarch carved in granite, but a country built on a simple conversion: earth into paper, paper into power, power into story. A nation where ownership is a kind of faith, and faith demands proof. And proof is often delivered at the barrel of something: rifle, pen, contract, foreclosure notice, lease agreement, marketing package. Different tools, same pressure. Was the Dunbar Ranch a triumph? You can say yes and be telling a truth. Men did endure out there. They did build. They did risk. They did learn the hard grammar of weather. They did make something that outlasted their own bodies. Was it also a theft? You can say yes and be telling a truth. Lines were drawn where none existed. Water was claimed. Neighbors were squeezed. Labor was spent and forgotten. Law was used like a club and called order. And when the land stopped giving, the cost was paid by the people with the least margin: the hands, the cooks, the small ranchers, the families whose names don't hang on signs. And the siege, what was it? Justice arriving late? Or just another transaction the moment the county tried to rebalance its books with gunfire? A moral reckoning? Or a land dispute dressed up as righteousness because men can't stand to admit they're simply hungry? If you step back far enough, the ranch shrinks into a shape on the prairie. The house becomes a pale rectangle, the corrals become lines, the river becomes a thread, the people become dots moving through weather. The sound of the wind takes over again, and the stories get quieter, and the land looks like it always did: patient, indifferent, older than any deed. And you begin to understand the coldest part of it. The land doesn't care who you said you were. The land doesn't care how you branded yourself. The land will let you build a palace, and it will let you lose it. It will let you die for water, and it will let you strike oil the next year. It will hold your bones and grow grass over them and not change its tone. So the light in that kitchen window still trembles on certain nights, and the snow still squeaks, and the wind still carries that metallic bite. And somewhere out in the dark you can imagine riders spaced in a crescent, only now the riders are time itself, circling every story we tell, waiting for us to decide what we're going to call it. And when you look at that place from far off, when you let the porch light become just a pinprick, when you let the house become just another shadow against the flats, when you let the river disappear into the dark, tell me, whose story did you believe, and what did it cost you to believe it?